кофеечек допью. И попрет.
So we're going to continue building our map application displaying earthquakes, and we're ready to start adding content to the map that we set up before.
Понеслась.
So then the question is, how do we add that content? And we know that our map is, well, it's part of a class that extends papplet. And so the two main methods that we've got where we're doing a lot of the hard work are the setup method and the draw method. And so it's a question, where do we put the definitions of all of these new objects that we want to create that will let us point at various parts in the map?
настройки делаем. Ну,
at the beginning of when the p-applet is launched, whereas the draw method gets executed over and over again every time we want to refresh the view. And all of
нельзя
these
чипсики.
objects that we're creating, the pointers
Всё,
to
закрыл.
various milestones and features of the map, we don't want to
Сорян.
create a new object every time the screen gets refreshed. What we'd love to do is just have a single instance of those class that represents a particular point that we're thinking about, and have that point somehow associated with the map as a whole. And then every time we need to refresh the map, we just say, hey, refresh everything that we've already created. And so for that reason, all of these definitions, all of the work that we're about to do, will get put in the setup method. And then when we execute the map.draw method within the p-applet's draw method, that map.draw method will go through all the objects that are associated with or attached to our map object and will refresh them as well. So let's think about adding a specific marker to denote a particularly significant earthquake that happened in Chile in 1960. And so what we'd like to do perhaps is indicate that location as something of note, and then put a dot on that location in our graphical representation. So let's think about some code that we could use to do that. And in the first line of code, notice that we're working with coordinates, which should be a little bit familiar to you from what Christine was doing earlier. So one of the great things about working with a library of methods and data types that were special built for a particular purpose is that a lot of the data types that we would naturally need have been defined for us already. And location is one of those examples. So in our earlier videos, we actually defined a class called simple location, and we tried to build in some of the functionality that locations ought to have. But we see over here in the documentation for unfolding maps that we already have that in the location class. And so notice that there are a couple of different constructors depending on which parameters we want to use, and then some public methods that we can use to both access and modify some of the properties of the location objects. So the first thing that we would want to do when putting a marker on this significant earthquake on its location in the world is to create a location object and set its coordinates to be the coordinates of the epicenter. Now once we have that location object, that still isn't associated with the map, and the way that we can associate or highlight a particular location on the map is to create a marker. So a marker is, well, it's what you think it might mean. And this is the beauty of having our Java objects mirror and be really models for the real life object, so that our code is readable and intuitive. So a simple point marker represents a single location, and it represents it using a circle. Now notice that there's something else in this documentation. Notice the documentation points out that the simple point marker implements something called a marker, and it's an interface called a marker. Now, an interface is something that indicates that we're dealing with an abstract data type. It's like a promise between the programmer and the person using the library's code that any data type that is that implements the abstract data type marker will have certain behaviors, will allow certain functionalities. And what the interface lets us do is hide some of the details of the implementation of how those functionalities are actually put into practice. So in our particular application, we don't really care whether our marker is a simple point marker or some other kind of marker. All we care about is that it's a way of denoting a specific location on the map. And so in our code, what we might say is that the variable val of type marker gets assigned to the object of type simple point marker. So when we're creating an object, we have to give it a concrete data type so that it can actually use the specific detail about is that it's a way of denoting a specific location on the map. And so in our code, what we might say is that the variable val of type marker gets assigned to the object of type simple point marker. So when we're creating an object, we have to give it a concrete data type so that it can actually use the specific details of the implementation of that class. But when we're going to be using or pointing to that object, all we'll need to know about it is that it's some kind of marker. And in particular, what we'll be doing with it is adding that marker to our map so that it gets displayed, and so that then when we execute the draw method, that marker will show up on our map. And so what we see is the map that displays the location of the Chile earthquake, and coming up we'll add richer data and more data. In a single object. And so what we might do if
Много
we're thinking
болтовни
a little bit
будет.
further about that important Chile, we had was a map with a single gray dot on it to indicate the epicenter of the Chile earthquake. But really where our map comes to life is when we add changing data based on the current earthquake data from around the world. And
Твою
what
мать.
we'd like to do that then is think about
Ты
handling
как смерть.
and displaying multiple markers and
Нет.
having those markers be customized based on properties of the earthquakes. And so let's think about how we can get to that level. So in order to deal with more complicated data and more complicated displays on our maps, it can be useful to separate two aspects of the data. We can separate out the properties that we're thinking of defining an earthquake from how we might want to represent visually those properties or that earthquake. And unfolding maps actually lets us do that in a very clean way using different data types. So one of these data types we're more familiar with, the marker interface, that tells us about how to place dots on particular locations in the map, and then how to style those dots. And so we've already talked about that, but the new piece that we're going to add in now is the feature class. And this feature class is a way of grouping together certain properties and saying this collection of information is somehow connected, and I want to encapsulate it in a single object. And so what we might do if we're thinking a little bit further about that important Chilean earthquake is we might want to add properties about that earthquake, like what was its magnitude, when did it occur, where was its epicenter, which is the only information we had before. And so what we might do now is create a feature or a variable of type feature that points to an object of type point feature. And that point feature says that it's associated with some location in the map, and then we can add properties to that object, and we get to decide what those properties are. So every time we'd like to add some attribute or some property to this object, to this collection of information about some location in our map, what we can do is use the add property method that's applied to us by the data type that's built into the library. And this method takes in two parameters. One is a string that represents the title of the title of the property that we're about to set, and then the second argument is the value of that property. And so we can see here that we've added properties for the title, for the magnitude, for the date, and then for the year. Now, once we have all of this information bunched into a nice tidy object of type point feature, what we can do is create a marker that uses that information. And for example, we can feed into this marker all of the properties that we had bundled together, and then add the marker to our map. And so at this point, when we run this in Eclipse, we won't see anything different from what we did before. The end result of what we've just done is still just to add a marker in the location of the epicenter of this Chilean earthquake from 1960. But in the background, under the hood, there's actually a lot more that we could access about that marker if we then wanted to style it in various ways, and we'll see that in a minute. So that's what we wanted to do if we had just a single marker that had some rich data associated with it. But maybe we want to think about not just the worst earthquake that was ever recorded, but maybe about say the top 5. And so we can look up some of the most significant earthquake events that have happened in the world and say we wanted to add those into our map. And so we want to translate this data into objects that then we can manipulate in our map. And so we could go ahead and do that in our code. And so we could create feature objects for each one of these earthquakes. And what we'd like to do now is, instead of having to deal with each one of these individually every time and remember the names of all the variables that we associated with it, etc., we'd like to somehow group them together into some data type that we can iterate over. And lists are fantastic for that. So what we might do is we might declare a list that contains point features, and it's going to point to a new array list that will contain point features. And so notice that in this declaration, we're doing two things that seem a little bit sophisticated. One is that we're using that interplay between an interface and a class that implements that interface. And so notice that the variable here is of type list, whereas the object that we created is of type array list, which is a data type that implements that abstract data type of list. And we have a support video coming up that will talk through some of those details, and we'll also talk in a lot of detail about interfaces and abstract data types next week. So there's more coming to that, but for now we want you to be comfortable using some of these constructs. The other piece here that we'll go into more depth in the support video is the fact that we're using numerics. So we're not just defining any old list, but we're also telling Java what kind of objects are being stored in this iterable list. We're saying that in particular, each one of the elements in this list is a point feature. And the advantage of that then is that when we go through the list and read off the objects one by one, we'll know that what we're getting back is a point feature. And so we'll be using all the methods that are associated with those point features. So once we've declared and created this object, now we can add elements to that list. And so we can go ahead and add those 5 significant earthquakes to that list. And the big advantage comes now when we want to represent those features in our map. And so we want to create markers for each of those features. Now, because we put all of those earthquake features in a list, in order to create the markers, what we could do is just iterate through that list. And we could say for each point feature in the list that we just created, what we're going to do is add a new marker to a list of markers. And that new marker is going to be constructed from the information that we get from the particular point feature that we got back from this list. So every time we create a new marker, what we're doing is we're giving it a particular location and particular collection of properties that are read off from one of these features that we created before. So the effect of having this for each point feature in this list of point features loop is that our markers list will be populated with a single marker for each one of these significant earthquakes, and then we can go ahead and add those markers to the map.
Какой-то модуль. City marker. Это наследуемый, запускаемый, это не запускаемый. Demos. Simple location. Я же не могу запустить simple location.
For the Unfolding Maps library, there's a bit of a theme here. We want to look at that documentation. We want to make sure that we understand what functionality is available to us as we use these different data types. One of the things that we can do to customize a marker is to set its color. And so we can go ahead and check for each of the markers in our list. Is it relatively recent, the event that is associated with this marker, or is its event older, more historical? And so we could set some thresholds for ourselves. For example, we could decide to style the more recent, i.e. after 2000 earthquakes to be yellow, and we could style the older ones, more historical ones, to be gray. And there's lots of opportunities for customization here. We'll invite you to do that as part of your project when you're working through the real live data. Now, as we're doing this, you might have noticed that we had to type in all of the features for each of these 5 earthquakes that we wanted to represent on our map. And that's cumbersome. It's time-consuming, and it's not scalable. And it's also not very dynamic. We update this list of features and then the list of markers that are associated with them that will be more scalable. And one thing that we've provided to you in the starter code that we hope you will find interesting is a parser. And that parser is designed to read in data from the USGS. And what the USGS provides to anyone who's interested in this data is an RSS feed, which is basically a bulletin that gets sent out as a text stream with updated information about earthquakes from around the world. And so we can download the current version of this text file, and you'll be doing that as part of your project. And if we feed that through the parse feed library that we've provided for you, what we can do is translate all of the earthquakes that are depicted in this text file to a list of features. And so we invite you to read through the parse feed class. It will be a bit of an exercise in tracing Java code. There's some complicated constructs that we use there, and as you work your way through the various courses in the specialization, you may feel more comfortable with some of the methods that we use. It's not required for you to understand all the details of the parser for this project or for this course, but that's part of the beauty of extending libraries as you're building code. The focus of your development time and energy is to design and build the project that you want, and you can use any tool at your disposal for that. And some of those tools may be written with techniques that you're not comfortable with, or that you're not that you don't have mastery over, but that's okay so long as you know how to incorporate the end results of those techniques and the end results of those tools into the work that you're trying to do. So in particular, you'll notice that in the parsefeed class, we have a method that will return to us a list of point features that then we can iterate over just like we did before and create a list of markers that then we can add to our map. So at the end of all this, what we create is this beautiful map of the world where we've got the markers corresponding to the most up-to-date information that we have from this RSS feed, and then we can go through the list of markers that we create, iterate over it, and customize the display of each of these markers based on whichever features you find most interesting and most important.
PDF-очка. Угу. Здесь PDF фака, короче. Задача программирования сделать реально что? Мой английский очень плохо. Задание по программированию, которое вы будете выполнять, будет в значительной степени зависеть от функции маркеров. There's a guide to help you understand how features and markers and can be used in your programming segment. Этот гайд поможет вам понять, как... Вот это я все забываю, что это. Это не черты лица. Особенности маркеры могут быть использованы в программировании. Вам нет необходимости читать. И это сейчас. Это здесь для вашего понимания назначения того, чего вы делаете. Здесь сюда вы обратитесь тогда, когда будете выполнять задание по программированию. Этот гайд показывает, как помочь ученикам, у кого есть сложности понимания между разными маркерами. Короче, какая-то дичь. Давай. Это руководство предназначено для помощи учащимся, которые используют трудности при различии классов Future и Marker. Окей. Сейчас мы только включаем методы этих классов. Те, которые более релевант, необходимы, уместны. We encourage. Мы поощряем креативность. Идите в API для каждого из этих классов, найдите их методы, которые могут быть вам полезны для выполнения задания. Давайте изучать классы future и point future. Здесь UML-диаграмма relationship, отношения, связи между future и point future. Это визуальное показание, как future и point future взаимоотношения имеют друг с другом. Point future — это подкласс из future. Все методы из класса future и API листа наследуют все методы особенно. API листа все перечисляют в наследованные методы отдельно. Но такое, ничего не понятно. В API после выбора метода суммирование их... Короче, какая-то дичь. Что вы несете? Вот число. В API после раздела заглавленного сводка метода есть раздел, в котором перечислены методы, наследованные от future. Ну, короче, понятно. API показывает наследованные методы. Ура! Давайте изучим больше об этом деле. Здесь еще одна диаграмма, которая показывает взаимоотношения между маркером и point маркером, simple point маркером. Как успехи? Да пока что-то как-то никак. Пока все что-то топчемся. Сейчас маркерочки рисовать будем на карте, как я понимаю. Я в понедельник подаю заявку в FoxMind. Я просто не знаю, в понедельник это сделать лучше или... То есть в понедельник, если мы начнем, то это получается понедельник, вторник, среда, четверг, пятница, суббота, воскресенье — это 7 дней. Потом понедельник, вторник, среда — это будет еще 3 дня. То есть у нас одни выходные получается. А если подать заявку, например, сегодня, ой, не сегодня, а завтра, тогда у меня, получается, попадает 2 выходных. Эти и следующие. Ну, просто за выходные я бы успел больше сделать. Я просто не знаю, они как они в выходные работают, не работают. Короче, как я понимаю, надо начинать это. Заказывать у них триал. Так, маркер интерфейс. Get property string k, hash map, string object. Ебона мать. Get string property. String. Get color. Через двоеточки, что возвращается через двоеточие, понятно, написано. Get location. Is inside. Между x и y. Хороший вопрос. То есть inside в 2 координатах. На прямой, что ли? Simple point marker void. Simple point marker location. Void simple point marker. Set radius. Since marker is an interface that simple point marker implements, the API for simple point marker will not list methods inherit. Как это правильно читается? Inherited from marker in the way we saw with point future and future. Так что, в понедельник подаем? Да я вот думаю, или завтра, или в понедельник. Мне бы хотелось, конечно, захватить 2 выходных. Но имеет ли это место быть? Имеет ли смысл? Все равно один выходной я в любом случае просру. это воскресенье, потому что в воскресенье я уезжаю на полдня. И вернусь я только поздно. Хороший вопрос. Я просто еще так не понял. Я написал, блядь, кто поедет, ну, кто подает, кто не подает. Все сидят, молчат. Чего молчат? Дима, как я понимаю, подал. Я не знаю, он будет продлевать, будет платить, не будет. Он, как я понимаю, у него какие-то сложности с этим. Ему тоже рано. У него нулевой пока, уровень нулевой, да и времени мало. И получается, чем с тобой вдвоем пойдем? Что там скидка если вместе подавать? Ну да, типа у нас типа там скидка есть 10%. Если мы какой-то хотя бы толпой в 3 человека придем. Хоть я бы. Форелс. У него скидка есть, вот. Договорился, но там условия, типа, мы идем несколько человек, и каждому по 10% скидки, вот он написал. Поэтому, если пойдем, то пойдем. Если не идем, то не идем. Определяемся, решаем, думаем. Я здесь сейчас по-быстрому прогоняю. Здесь сейчас по-быстрому прогоняю что? Где здесь? Кого прогоняешь? Кого ты прогнал? Верни людей назад. There won't be a selection title methods inherited from marker. Instead, we have to do some investigation. О, господи, что за слово такое?
Investigating.
Investigating. Расследовать. Ссылочка заблочилась. У меня вроде...
Кто хочет изучить Java. В этих видео я буду...
Здорово. 15-й год, блин. 15-й год это важно, как говорил Ларин. Окей, погоняй пока. It is from marker. At the top of the API for any class there will be a selection titled All Implementing Interfaces. For simple point marker, we will see marker listed here. Since this is the top of the page for the developers of unfolding maps. As we will understand that all markers methods are instanted by simple point marker. Типа про наследование, короче, говорится о том, что simple point marker наследует все от маркера, и об этом написано у нас в документации. If you want to know that what those instead methods are, then we simply click on the link for marker. How we do associate point future and simple point marker. То есть маркер это интерфейс, да? Да, интерфейс. Мы наследуем интерфейс. В интерфейсах, насколько мы помним, реализации никакой нет. То есть здесь просто методы, которые необходимо, как это называется, переопределить. Override. Переопределить, по-моему. Как это? Перегрузить. Перегрузку методов надо сделать каких-то конкретных. И пока мы их не перегрузим, у нас работать это не будет. А здесь у нас идет extends. Да? If you already have point future object, then you can use that extend point future to create a simple point marker. The constructor for simple point marker accepts the location and a hash map. The location is where this point future will appear on the map. The hash map contains the properties of the point future. Those two pieces of information we get from point future object using the getLocation and getProperties methods. Окей. То есть с помощью двух геттеров мы получаем информацию. Ну, строго говоря, override это не перегрузка, overload это перегрузка. Override это переопределение. Я просто немножко термины забыл. Пардон. Пардон и здравствуйте. Сейчас буду тупить. Я сейчас вот почему хочу в очень интересен Fox-Minded. Мне интересно, как они-то. Они же там вроде как это. Ну, больше практики дают, надеюсь. Когда они дадут много практики, я начну очень много писать. Когда начну много писать, сразу же со всем этим быстро разберусь. Но я думаю, что месяц я буду биться головой об стену, да, там, в какие-то в тупые ситуации буду вставать, да, кавычки забыл, полчаса голову ломал, почему не компилится, да, там еще что-то там. А потом более-менее наладится, пойдет. Дело практики. Дратати. This approach. Господи, что слово такое? Подход.
Approach.
Approach. Чё?
Approach.
Approach.
Approach. Approach. Approach.
Approach. Блять. This approach creates a single simple point marker object with its location and properties set when you create it. Another approach is to create simple point marker using its default nor argument constructor. Then set a location and properties after it's be created. There are many other ways to reach this same result. Reach это достигать, что ли? Да, достичь. Угу. Короче, говорит, что есть два метода, два конструктора, такой и такой. Считай два языка одновременно учишь английский. Да, серьезно. И это, блин, на самом деле, сука, сложно. Я серьезно говорю, просто это еще после работы и с мыслями о том, что завтра опять на работу. То есть между работой и работой я учу Яву и английский, блядь. Сейчас произношение потихонечку, может быть, выправлю, да, словарный запас какой-то чуть поднабью, потому что в любом случае английский учить надо. Creating a list of simple point markers. Let's say you have a list of point future objects. List point future, то есть мы создаем, грубо говоря, набор данных типа point future, будем туда запихивать. Я вот не понимаю, point future, это можно как-то... да, я понял. Ну давай. Понятно. А так можно? Это вот этот future, будущее? Точечный. Point future. Особенность, черта, деталь. Фича? А есть Ну блин. Point фича. Подожди, а как же будущий тогда? Ой. Английский. Футуристичный. Да, видишь, у тебя вообще неплохой английский, я смотрю. Молодой человек. Потрежьте мозга чуть-чуть. Типа футуризм. Футуре. Ну, сука, я тупой. Пардон. А что я здесь чат веду? У меня же на телефоне чат есть. Assume. О, господи, что за сложные слова. Предполагать. Я помню, но я уже третий раз его встречаю. Как говорит практика, 21 раз встречаешь, после этого запоминаешь. Assume that this list is already populated with Point features. А как правильно произносится? Ну-ка.
Point feature.
Point feature.
Можно не говорить так.
Point feature.
Точечный.
Point feature. Point feature. Point feature. Point feature. Feature. Feature.
Feature. Ох, этот акцент будет ужасный. Assumes that this list is already populated with point feature, each with its own location. Now you want to visually represent those point features on map. To do that, create an empty list of simple point markers. То есть для того, чтобы начать выводить все это на карту, эти точечки, создаем пустую дичь. Хорошо. We need to take a location of each point feature in out features list and add a new simple point marker to your markers list. Creating our markers list using this method gives us a correlation between the two lists. The list feature relates to the first marker, the second feature to the second marker, etc. Any method is right way as long as... Это какая-то... Любой метод является верным, если он выполняет свою работу. Это же какие-то такие интересные слова. Так что просто используйте тот, который подходит вам лучше всего. Классная ходовочка, прям мне нравится. Go next. Бонус. А это видос из Гугла, что ли?
So it turns out that unfolding maps gives us amazing functionality well beyond the scope that we're using for this particular project. If you want to go further and see a different example that uses markers in a very different way from what we just did, stay tuned for the next few videos where we'll be thinking about how to display life expectancy.
Тут еще могут быть вопросики. Нет, здесь вопросиков не будет. А вот следующие, может, будут. Сейчас покажу, если будет. Нет, здесь тоже не будет. Здесь желтые точечки на линии появляются, и видео останавливается, и надо ответить на тест. Не ответил петух.
And then you'll organize that data using objects, both from the unfolding libraries and objects that you define themselves.
Да.
And you will be thinking about organizing
Их тут еще несколько.
using some abstract data types. So let's start by setting up the problem. And this example I just find really striking. So what we'll be doing is annotating a map of the world. So we'll look at all of the countries in the world, and we'll be thinking about data for average life expectancy at birth. You can think about a person born on the other side of the world from you, and as they start off their life journey, how long might they expect to have on this world? So there's data collected by the World Bank, and you can read it in. And what we've done is annotate this picture of the world, this map of the world, so that the bright red spots are countries where the average life expectancy at birth is somewhere around 45 years. And the bright blue spots have average life expectancy around 85 to 90 years. And so just in this
Средняя
visualization,
продолжительность жизни.
the range of life expectancies we might find globally. And this is pretty striking, and so by the end of the videos, you'll be able to do similar visualizations with all sorts of data sets that are available online and in other sources, and that we'll also make available for you through this course. So the life expectancy data that we might get, say from the World Bank, for example, comes to us as a spreadsheet, comma-separated values, lots and lots of rows in this file, and we want to make sense of it. We want to present it in a way that's easier to understand and organize. So when we have a high-level objective, like drawing pictures or visualizing data on a map, it's useful to break it down into manageable chunks before we sit down to program a solution up. And so for this particular problem, we can think of our project in 3 stages. First, we might set up the map, configure the window, and display the countries. Then we might go to reading in the data and looking at the data file that we have. And finally, we can convert that data into a visualization on the map. So the videos will be separated into these 3 stages, and we'll wrap up this video by setting up our map. So this is a good opportunity to think back to the beginning of your project, and you've already played around with similar code where we declare a class, we create a new class that extends papplet and uses the unfolding maps library. So in this class definition, we are we're in a new file, the life expectancy file, and remember that the file name has to match the class name. And what we're going to do is create a map, and then we have to define 2 methods. The 2 methods that will set up our applet and then draw it continuously while the applet is running to update the view. Okay, so let's start by setting up the map. And that first line of code is setting up the size of the canvas. We've seen that in a few earlier videos, so hopefully it's familiar at this point. And then beyond that, we're creating a new map. So we're using the constructor for the unfolding map, and we're creating a new map object that we'll be manipulating and using throughout the project. All right, this is slightly new, and what we're doing here is using one of the built-in methods in the unfolding maps library. And what this method does is allow the user to interact with the map in some limited ways. So by invoking maputils.createDefaultEventDispatcher, which all seem like magic words at this point, but if you invoke this little magic command, what that happens when we run our applet is that double-clicking leads to zooming in the map, and we can do some panning around in the world. Now, computer science is not magic, and we will make all of this clear in a future module. We will talk about event handlers, we'll talk about what's going on under the hood, but for now, in order to add some added interactivity, we use this line of code. Okay, so we've set up the map a little bit, we've created a map object, and we've configured its size. And now if we go ahead into that draw method, we can call the map's own draw method. Each unfolding map comes with its own draw method that will refresh the screen based on the current objects and parameters associated with the map. And so at this point, what we have
Компьютерная не магия,
default canvas
но для
with
девушки-программиста в ее-то возрасте точно нет. Какой универ заканчивал тогда? Сейчас магия — это если человек нормально табуретку точит. Вот это магия. А нас, компьютерщиков, уже за людей не считают. Беспердел. А чё здесь осталось-то по фигне? 8 минут, 11 минут, 8 минут. Блять, полчаса видео. Ёбаный насос. Я думал, я сертифицированный маг. Ты знаешь, сколько стоит сертификация на Яве? Это пипец. Я плакал, когда смотрел. Я просто понимаю, что мне придется заплатить эти деньги. Попытка сертификации стоит на 1 уровень, то есть на минимальный уровень. То есть там 3 уровня, есть 3 уровня сертификата. Первый уровень 16 тысяч рублей, второй уровень 16 тысяч рублей, третий уровень 70 тысяч рублей. Попытка. А там, как говорится, не очко обычно губит, а к 11 туз. Не сдал, пан и пропал. Пусть пока видос крутит.
Welcome back to this second of 3 videos where we'll be developing a project together. We're going to build a map that visualizes life expectancy around the world, and we've broken up that task into 3 pieces. In the first video, we talked about setting up the map, and I hope that you've opened up Eclipse and tried out that beginning setup procedure, and that now you're ready to work with me.
16 тысяч за попытку. Казино прям.
The life expectancy data, and then we'll display the map in that 3rd video. So this is our end goal. What we'd like to see when we finish this project is the range of colors from bright red to indicate countries with a very low average life expectancy at birth to a bright blue color for countries with a very relatively high life expectancy, average life expectancy at birth. And all of that data is encapsulated in this data file that we can read in from the World Bank. And this file is formatted as a whole bunch of rows, and each row contains data about a single country. So there's some header information in the file, and then we see that each of the fields is going to be separated by commas. And so understanding how to read files and manipulate files where we have formatted data, rows, each with a similar format in each row containing fields separated by commas, will be very powerful because lots of data is passed around in this way. So what we'd like to do is to store data's associating countries with average life expectancy at birth, and a really powerful data structure for doing so is the map data structure. Now, take a minute. We're going to use map in two different ways in this video, and so you want to make sure to keep straight which map we're talking about. And so at this point, when we say map, we mean an association or a function that relates something like you want to think of input values to output values. So a map is going to associate keys, like countries, with values, their average life expectancy at birth. And so we're going to take the data from that file, that CSV file, and store it in a data structure in our class, and that data structure is going to keep track of what life expectancy belongs to each country. So this is an example of a general data type, an abstract data type called map, and you can keep in mind this image of keys being associated with values. And what's important here is that every key is associated with exactly one value. You're not going to have one country with two different values associated with it. And so in our particular example, the keys are the country identifiers, and the values that we want to store for each country is that average life expectancy. And both the keys and the values have types, and those types are going to be different because they're different kinds of objects, but there is some relationship between them, which is why we're storing them as ordered pairs. Okay. So there is that word abstract. We're talking about abstract data types, and we haven't talked about those in this lesson yet, nor in this course. We will talk about those. Stay tuned in an upcoming module. In our application, we'd like to create a map with the country IDs as the keys and the life expectancy as the values. Now, it's a little bit complicated to read in the data from a file and create this data structure and then put the information from
Можно
the
было
data
бы
file
изучить
into
карты
the data structure.
отображения. Ну,
And we
блин.
don't want to clutter up our
С одной
setup
стороны,
method
да, мне
that
очень
talks about
нравится
setting up
английский.
the applet
Не
that we would,
не как
display
язык,
to the user.
а как
We don't want to
источник
clutter up
информации.
that method with all of this code that's
Люди
very
живут там
detailed
умнее
and
наших.
isn't so hard to follow. It is
Информация
pretty hard
там
to
больше,
follow. And so what we're
интересно.
going to do is carve
Да
it
и
out of the setup method and create a new helper method that we can follow
когда
through
получаешь
separately.
информацию
And
оттуда,
so in the setup, all we say is
такое
that
ощущение,
the
что
map
получаешь
LifeX
какую-то
by country
секретную
is
информацию,
going to be created
которую
by
просто
invoking
никому
this
просто
helper
так,
method.
ну ладно,
Now, in
99%
terms of
населения
class
точно не
design, a
знает.
good rule of thumb to extend what Christine earlier said is that when we have helper
Это
methods
как бы
that are
стирает
really
рамки
for
между
this
тобой
organization
и другими
purpose, we want to
странами.
keep them private. We don't need to send them out into the world. Okay, so we want to have a private helper method, and let's think about how we're specifying it. What it takes in is the file name that's going to lead us to the data, and then what we want to return after executing this method is the map that associates countries with with life expectancy. Okay, so we can go ahead and think about what we need to have in there. And the first thing we need to do is to construct the map, to construct that object that's going to hold the countries and the life expectancy. Now there's something a little funky here, and you'll notice that
Долго ты еще
the
будешь
data type
рассказывать?
of the
Ядрить,
map
колотить.
that we're declaring here is just map, but when we invoke a constructor, we're saying we want a new hash map. And that's different from other times that we've used constructors. Other times that we've used constructors, when we've created a new object, the type of the object that we're creating matches the constructor that we're using.
Я так
Now,
понимаю,
this is
в
a
фокусе
subtle
обучения
point, and
будет
it
в
comes,
следующем формате.
you'll see a lot more
Ну-ка,
details about that
давай.
when we talk about abstract classes. tying into
Какой
that
формат?
abstract
Тебе
data
дают
type.
задание
But for
и
now,
документацию к
the way that you can
изучению.
think about this is that we want a map,
Так,
and the kind of map, the way that it's being implemented, the details of it is that it's going to be a hash map. But the functionality that we
решаешь
care
и
about is that
сдаешь.
it's a map, that it has keys and values.
Да?
Okay, so that's the first thing we do, we construct it.
Это ты со слов
Once we
Димы
have
понял?
the map declared, what we'd like to do is populate it. And we're populating it from fields in the file. And so we'd like to read in all the files, and we're going to do that taking in one row at a time and sticking the contents of a single row into an array of strings.
Если не хочешь не переплачивать, ты
Now
должен
we
по-быстрому
iterate
прогнать
through
инфу
all of the
сделать.
strings that we've just read in, so each row one at a time.
Ну, ты имеешь в
And
виду
we can use
переплачивать в том плане,
for
что
each
чем
row
дольше ты тупишь,
in
тем больше ты платишь.
the array of strings rows construct. So it's a special for loop that lets us iterate over an entire array. And what we're going to do is for each row, we'd like to parse away just the relevant information. If you remember in the data file, each row had some beginning kind of junk columns that told us the title of the data series, and then it had that relevant piece that we cared about, the country,
Вы
and
хотите
then
это
also the average
решать
life
на стримах?
expectancy at birth.
Или
And so
каждый
what we'd
будет
like to
сам
do is
решать?
parse the string that comes to us from the file, the entire row, and pick off just the important
Тоже
parts.
такой довольно-таки
And so what we can
щепетильный
do
вопрос.
is take a single string, which is that entire row, and split it based on a separating character.
Потом человек
And so we
просмотрит
know
твое
that in
решение,
a
дает рекомендации к исправлению.
comma-separated values file, a CSV file, every time there's a comma, we have a new field. And so we're going
То
to
есть, ну,
split
если
the
я буду
rows
решать на стримах, и вы
string
будете смотреть,
into an array of strings.
у нас будет, в
Each
принципе,
of
одинаковое
the
решение.
elements in the array of strings is another string that is a field. Okay, but now what we'd like to do is just read off the fields in particular values, and so we have some logic to pick out exactly the columns that we need. Okay, so looking in a little bit deeper into what we're doing, what we'd like is the country ID and the life expectancy. Now the country ID is a string, will be a string forever and after. We don't need to worry about that, but we are doing something in that the first line that is highlighted in that box, and that is we want to read off a float, a number type for the life expectancy. But in the data file, we just read it in as a string, and so we're casting the string, we're converting the string to a float. And so we have a method that lets us do that. So now that we've read all of the rows from the data file into our map, we have access to all of the information that pairs the country ID with its average life expectancy at birth, and we're ready to move to the next part of the big picture of our project, which is to display the data that we've just read in and convert it into some visual
Ты получаешь чувака,
visualization
который
on
тебя
it.
на правильный путь сразу наставляет. Но если нет базы нормальной, то плати больше. Ну, база, в принципе, у нас есть. Ну, какая-никакая есть. Надо у Димы стырить задание. Давай стырим у него задание. Тут получается, смотри, вот первое. Решаем ли мы на стримах или не решаем? Я за то, что прогнать базу нужно. Что ты имеешь в виду под базой? Как методы пишутся, как все вот это? Это я про себя. Не, я понимаю. Просто база, она у нее так, границы размытые такие. То есть у кого-то база это как правильно синтаксис выглядит, у кого-то база это как стандартные библиотеки работают, у кого-то база это еще что-то дальше. Сложно понять. Просто one part shield. Первая часть шилда. Но прогони первую часть шилда. Там, в принципе, все нужное. Согласен. Первая часть шилда, она нужная. Я так и не понимаю, мы на стримах будем это решать или не будем? Или мы будем в оффлайне все это решать? А так, в Дискорде переписываться. Я просто думаю, что если мы будем решать это на стримах, что нам тогда всем покупать одно и то же? Или у нас будет... у нас же, наверное, будут разные задания, да? Или нет? Хороший вопрос. Смысл тогда индивидуального обучения? Ну да, то есть я согласен с тем, что на стриме решать это резона нет. По крайней мере, друг у друга подглядывать резона нет. Почему? Потому что кто-то не будет думать, кто-то спишет. Будет шляпа. Что-то я прям задумался. Ну, я как думаю, 10 дней халявных у нас в любом случае есть. Первый месяц проплатим, посмотрим, что будет из этого. То есть 40 дней в итоге у нас будет. А по итогам за 40 дней можно понять, есть ли смысл мутить это. Или может за 40 дней мы сорвем, может мы проепланим все эти 40 дней. Или кто-то из нас. Может мы сорвем там кураж и попрем. Я не готов, конечно, за 3 месяца по 3500 выкинуть. Но что будет? Я готов, конечно, за 3 месяца по 3500 вкинуть. Но это в вашей валюте. В нашей это 9000. Но чтобы это не вылилось в то, что мне сначала нужно было прогнать, а потом платить. Но вот я хочу посмотреть, какое задание будет у Димы. То есть, если я сейчас с ним более-менее смогу начать справляться, то будет одно. Если не смогу, то это другое. Потому что, на мой взгляд, вот я честно сижу, вот мне сейчас любую задачу дай, и дай хоть эту. Вот как раз-таки документацию, куда копать, куда смотреть. И я, в принципе, готов прям по кайфу. Я сяду и буду пилить. То есть не так, чтобы, понимаешь, вот есть варианты, когда я тебе сейчас скажу, там, сделай мне приложение с веб-сервисом. И ты такой, блядь, а какую технологию использовать, какую библиотеку, что за приложение, какие данные она должна кидать, что, куда, как, кому, зачем. Или другой подход. Сделай приложение с веб-сервисом. Используй вот этот метод, используй вот эту библиотеку, чтобы оно возвращало вот это и вот это. И вот тебе документация. Откуда ее брать? Или пример какой-то, да, там. Ты такой, по кайфу, давай, изи. А разница элементарная, просто наличие документации и пути нужно. А о том, что там поначалу будешь тупить, ну, как раз первые 10 дней, они на разгон, в принципе, и есть. Кажется, вот будет потолок того, что будет необходимо именно в программе. Но это как получается? Это же получается не проект, это получается просто обучение. Вот если мы хорошо пойдем, и не будем ебланить, не будем тупить, то за 3 месяца мы, в принципе, программу обучения пройдем. Нужно пробовать. Нужно из Димы вытащить инфу. Молчит партизан. Ну, завтра-то точно ответит. Может, мне хоть понять. А то он сказал, что у него array-лист там есть. Ну, array-лист вот он есть. В принципе, пожалуйста. Просто в этом курсе, вот, я сейчас смотрю, курс то же самое. Вот тебе инструкция о том, как делать. Вот тебе библиотека. Делай. Вот тебе видосы о том, как делать. Но прям не написано, прям, что напиши вот здесь вот это. Напиши вот здесь вот это. Такого тоже не пишут. Поэтому интересно.
All right, we're in step 3 of this project to visualize average life expectancy around the world. And in this video, we're going to build on what we've done in the previous two. So we've already set up the map and we've already read in the data from the CSV file, which tells us the average life expectancy for each country. And now we want to translate that data into the colors of this map. And so hopefully you've implemented everything that we've done so far in
Вот, в
Eclipse,
принципе, мне
and
дает
you're ready to
задание.
get
То,
going
что у тебя
and
сейчас
do this
будет
last piece with
с
us.
RSS получен
So
файл.
the data
Файл
we'll
ты
need
должен
in order to
распарсить.
annotate
После
the
того, как ты его
map with
распарсил,
this
ты должен все это
information
вывести
is
в виде
not
точек
only
на
the
карту.
life
И после
expectancy
этого
for
ты
each
должен
country, but
разрисовать
also
по
how the
цветам их,
countries
в зависимости от
look
каких-то условий.
on the global map itself,
Все.
what their coordinates are, and
Вот
how
тебе
they
библиотека, вот тебе
how they
задание, вот
occupy
тебе
space
файл.
in the map.
Делай.
So that information is located in a file in the data directory of the Unfolding Maps
Принцип
library, and
такой
it's
же.
called countries.go.json. JSON is an extension that indicates we've got formatted text. Now, in order to pull all of this information together, the geographical information about the countries, as well as their life expectancies, we want to design some objects or use some predefined objects that help us organize both geographic locations and features or properties of these locations. So what we're going to think about are the underlying groupings of the properties and locations as distinct from their visual representations on the map. And in fact, Unfolding as a library has some classes that are able to manage that distinction for us. So when we're just thinking about a particular location in the world and its associated properties, we want to define or use the type feature. So use objects of type feature for talking about locations with properties. But then when we want to translate those into some sort of visual representation on the map, then we could use the marker class in the Unfolding library, which then lets us style how these properties might impact
По
what we
видосам
display on the
постараюсь
map.
выжить, что забыл. Ну
So
давай.
let's think
Ну там,
about
если что, быстро
how we
нагоним,
are
не
going to
переживай.
store all of this information because we have a lot of countries. And so we want to have a list of features and also a list of markers. So this is another example of an abstract data type. In the previous video we saw the abstract data type map, which
Я до
let us
понедельника
store
постараюсь
pairs
выполнить
of
вот это задание все.
pieces of information, pairs of objects. And now we've got
Пройти вот этот
lists.
курс.
And lists are relevant
Потому что
whenever
после
we want
понедельника его поход
a
забанят.
collection of objects that are ordered in some way.
Ну что, подожди, еще
So
проверим.
we're going to build which
Пипец.
let us store.
Где ты нажал? My course profiles. До какого числа у меня это открыто? Ничего не понятно. А до какого числа у меня это? 5 августа. Нет? Ends август 5. Ends август 5. А, то есть не неделя, а 2 недели, что ли, дали? Семь дней начал позавчера. А почему 5 августа? Inactive. Complete updates. До 1 июля вам ответим. Смотри, ваша финансовая помощь была отменена, потому что вы начали триал. Хорошо, что я сделал себе отдельный аккаунт. Начинаешь триал, все сбрасывается. Хорошо, что я, блядь, сделал себе отдельный аккаунт и оттуда наныл тоже нормально. Бесплатный триал начат. Господи. Три дня назад. То есть у меня осталось, в принципе, 4 дня. Ну, короче, в любом случае до понедельника. Я, по-моему, в понедельник начал, и вот оно и отвалится скоро.
Pairs of pieces of information, pairs of objects, and now we've got lists. And lists are relevant whenever we want a collection of objects that are ordered in some way. Okay, so we've already seen lots of examples of lists. For example, when you think about
У меня осталось как раз 3 недели.
that's a particular implementation of a list. And we'll talk more about this data type and its implementations
3 недели, 3 дня.
But for now, we want to think about a list of features, each one associated with a country. So once we have these features and markers, we want to add them to the map, which means that we display the markers. But not only do we want to add them to the map, we want to manipulate them. And what we'd like to do is
В субботу придется поднапрячься, чтобы все закончить. Зато за субботу можно получить смело целиком сертификат, законченный по этому курсу. Я, правда, не знаю, как он будет выглядеть, но зато посмотрим.
Okay, so this is our helper method. Remember that our rule of thumb is that they are private. Unless there's a reason to open it up to the world, we're going to keep it private. And what we're going to do is go through all of the markers that we created. Remember, there's one marker for each country. And what we'd like to do is, for each of the markers, for each of the countries and their associated markers, we're going to decide how to color the marker. And the coloring is going to depend on the life expectancy. Now, that life expectancy is a number. The number is typically between 45 and 90. And that number is stored in the map data structure, right? We can access it by saying, hey map, I would like the value associated with the key country. And so we pass as an argument to the get method of the map, the country ID, or the string that has that country ID. And then the map object gives us back the value associated with that key, and that's a float. Once we have that number, well, we'd like to translate that number to a color. And this is where I apologize, because not only do we have 2 ways of using the word map in the sequence of videos, we now are including a third. So let's think back to all of the maps that we've used. We've got the global map, the picture, the map of the world. We've got map the data structure, which associates keys with values. And now we've got map the method, and this is a built-in method in the library, and it's a really useful one. So this method map lets us take a number in a predefined range and map it into its comparable location in a different range of values. So in this particular instance, we're taking the number, which is the life expectancy of the country that we're currently focusing on. And we know that the life expectancy ranges from between 40 in countries with the lowest average life expectancy to 90 at the top end. And we'd like to translate that to something to do with color. And if you think back to a couple of videos ago, when we first introduced colors and the RGB codes for colors, remember that those RGB channels had minimum value 0 and maximum value 255. So we'd like to translate the range 40 to 90 over to the range 0 to 255, so we're in a range of numbers that's more compatible with color codes. And this map method lets us do just that. Okay, so we invoke it. What we get back from it is a float, and we're going to cast it to an integer, because for the RGB colors, we just deal with integers. So in the RGB coding of colors, we want an integer between 0 and 255 for each of the 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. All right, so we've translated the life expectancy of the color that of the country that we're focusing on to some integer value between 0 and 255. And what we'd like to do is countries that have really low life expectancy, relatively speaking, are going to be colored bright red. So bright red means that the red channel should be at highest possible, somewhere around 255. And if we want the countries that have very high life expectancy to be colored bright blue, then for those, the blue should be high, 255, and all the other channels should be pretty low. And so we can define the color of the marker appropriately. So the red channel is going to be the first argument of the color method, and it's going to be 255 minus the number that we just calculated. So if the color level that we calculated is 0, then the color that we're setting our marker to is going to be very close to 255. It's going to be 255. So it's going to be a very, very red marker. And the other 2 arguments are going to be very low. And so we'll see that bright red color. And on the other side, if the color level that we calculated corresponds to a really high life expectancy, then we're going to get a large number, which means that the red channel, that first argument to the color method, will be very low, and so our marker will be a bright blue. Now, think back about this logic that you see in this code, and we have an if-else in there. And if that if-else is dependent on the conditional statement, if lifeexpmap.contains key of country ID. Well, what on earth does that mean? It could be that the marker that we're looking at currently has a country ID that doesn't show up in the file of life expectancies. It could be that when the World Bank put together all of their data on life expectancies, they weren't able to reach the statistics of one particular country. And we don't want our code to crash just because we don't have information about a particular country. So what we're going to do is check. We're going to ask our map, the map that associates countries with life expectancy, if they actually have a value of life expectancy for the country that we care about. And if there is such a life expectancy for the country we care about, then we go ahead and do our calculation that we just did, and we color the marker appropriately. But if we don't, then we want to have some sort of default setting for what that color is going to be. And remember when Christine was talking in her supplementary video about color codes, she mentioned that if we set all 3 colors, R, G, and B, to the same value, then what we get is a shade of gray. So our default color for the marker is just going to be a shade of gray if we don't happen to have information about the life expectancy of a particular country. All right, we've done it. What we've done now is we've colored the whole world based on the data in the life expectancy file. And what's really powerful about the techniques that we've gone through in these 3 videos is that really most of what we were talking about doesn't depend on the fact that we're talking about life expectancies. Anytime we have a data file that tells us some values associated with country IDs, we can do exactly the same process and color the world based on all sorts of other information and data.
All right, in this support video, we're going to look at Java's list interface, the ArrayList class, as well as how to use generics with each of these different types. You've already seen Mia working with lists and array lists and using generics, and you're going to be using these classes and generics in your project. But if you're feeling like you need a little bit more review or overview of what these classes and what generics are, then watch the support video. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to comfortably work with array lists and lists in Java, which are both built into Java, and you'll also be able to create these objects to work with Java generics. So let's go back to one of the examples that Mia used in her video. She created this list, countries, that stored an array
Как
list.
класс расстановить?
So for now in this example, I just want you to ignore this piece right here.
Ты 1С имеешь в виду? А, я не помню, у меня пароли какие там. На службу, ну вот здесь просто диспетчер задач. Службы. И там будете 1С правой кнопкой остановить. Все. Ага, ок. Ок, так ок. Пойдем дальше.
Inside the angle brackets. That's the generics part of this, and we're going to talk about that later. But for now, what I want you to focus on is the types of the variable as well as the object that gets created. So the variable that gets created, countries, is of type list. And you can see over here that the object that gets created is type array list. So you might be kind of worried at this point. You might be thinking, what's going on? These two types are not the same. Is that even allowed? And the
Взаимоудаляться
answer is
висят.
that yes, this is absolutely allowed in Java. And we're going to explain briefly what's going on.
Бывает.
So a
Хотя
list,
странно.
as Mia mentioned in her video, is what's called an abstract data type. And what it is it's a Java interface, which we're going to get into more in the next module. But what that means is it specifies some behavior.
Видимо, где-то
this
скуль
object has to
заглючил.
have,
Средствами
but it
скуля
doesn't
же
talk
бэкап
about
делается.
exactly how that behavior is going to be implemented. So you can use that as the type of a particular variable. On the other hand, over here, when we actually create the object itself, that's an actual class. So the array list is an actual class that's built into Java, and it implements all of the behavior that's specified by the list interface. This class can be instantiated. And it's perfectly okay to have an interface as the type of the variable and the actual class as the type of the thing that you instantiate.
У меня
That's
такого
done
не
a
было.
lot.
Или
And
было.
again, don't worry too
И я
much about the
внимания не
details
обращал.
here. We're going to get more into this in the next
Он
module,
просто
as
начальник
well
говорил,
as
что
in
что-то
future
место
courses in
кончилось там.
specialization.
И он что-то удалял.
For now,
Я
let's
просто не
just
знаю,
ask the
там
question,
написано,
okay, we've
что
got an array list object.
удалять по
Let's think
завершению
about what
по
can it
нехватке
do?
места.
Well, if I want to know what a
Старой
class that's
версии
built
или
into
нет.
Java can do, where should I look? How about the Java docs? That's your go-to place to figure out what can my class that's built into Java actually do. Here's a URL for the Java docs for version 8. If you're using a different version of Java, you'll need to change that 8 to a 7 or whatever version you happen to be using. Or my favorite is I just Google for Java doc documentation and then whatever version of Java I happen to be using, and this link will come right up. So if I click on this link, it's going to take me to this page here, and that's the overview for the Java documentation. And now the question is, where the heck is array list? How are you going to find it? Well, there's a couple ways. You can either look down here. This is this full list of all the classes and libraries that are built into Java. So you will find array list in this big long list, but it's pretty long. So a faster way to get yourself to array list is look in this pattern in java.util. So then you can go down here to the list of classes that are shown, click on the array list class, and up will come the documentation for the array list. Okay, so now you've got the documentation page for the array list, and it's pretty long, and it talks about a lot of things the array list can do, and I just want to call out a few different methods that you're going to find useful. Okay, now let's talk about setting an element in an array and an array list. To set an element in an array, you just use that square bracket notation and you put it on the left-hand side of your assignment statement. So in this case, we're taking a feature that's stored in the variable f, and we're putting it into the 0th index position in our array, country array. To do this in an array list, we're going to use the method called set. Set takes two arguments, a index location, in this case 0, and the thing we're trying to put there. And again, countries is our array list, and we can call the set method on our countries variable, passing in 0 for the index position and f, the feature we want to store there. Now again, our array list in both cases, our array and our array list, have to have at least one element in them, space for one element, otherwise we're going to get another index out of bounds exception. Again, if you want to see the Java documentation, it looks like that. Finally, let's talk about how to get the length or the size of an array list. So with an array, you know that you can just call that length field. So I say country array.length, that will give me back the number of elements in my array. But for an array list, it's just a little bit different. Instead of calling a length field, we're going to call the size method. So down here, we can see we call a method called size, which is just like length in an array. It returns the number of elements that are in the array list. Now notice one important thing, that size is actually a method, so we have to have these parentheses even though they're empty. It takes no parameters. It just returns the size of the array list. So we can see that arrays and array lists are very, very similar, just some minor differences in how you interact with them. But arrays, it turns out, are actually a little bit more powerful. Sorry, array lists are more powerful than arrays. Because arrays, as you know, once you create them and set their size, they're fixed. But array lists can expand to incorporate more elements. So there are these two methods of array lists, add, they take different numbers of parameters, and what they do is they actually append the new element onto the end of the list, increasing the size of the array list as necessary. So that's kind of cool. It doesn't force you to specify how big you want your array beforehand. Java will automatically resize the array list for you. So that's one of the reasons we often use array lists instead of arrays, because they provide this extra flexibility. Okay, so now let's go back to this issue of generics. So now we're going to talk about the code that's inside those angle brackets. Notice that we're creating here two different lists. There's countries and country markers. And they're both lists, but the difference is that countries stores features and country markers stores markers. So this is what this generics capability allows us to specify. What we put in the angle brackets is the type of object that we want Java to store inside the container that we're creating. So in this case, we're creating a list. The first list is allowed to store features, and the second list is allowed to store markers. Now when we go to create these objects that are referenced by these variables, we again have to say what kind of thing goes into the container object. So we can see over here on the left-hand side, we've said the first list is going to store features, the second list is going to store markers, and so on the right-hand side, the first array list stores features, the second array list stores markers, and these types have to match. Now what this allows us to do, if we add a bit more code, let's say we've got some code here that will put some elements into both of these lists. The cool part about generics is, now when we get elements out of the list, when we get elements out of country, say we get the element at position 0, we know that countries stores features, so we can get back a feature type reference. On the other hand, country markers, we declared was going to store markers. So when we get an element back from country markers, it's going to be of marker type. So it's the same exact method. This get method is going to return a different type depending on what we declared the container to store. So that's really cool. We don't have to use any casts or anything like that. It just happens automatically for us. And bringing this back around to the Java docs, if you look at that get method in the Java docs, you'll see that it lists the return type as E. And what that means is that it's this generic type that's going to take on whatever type you declare the container to hold. So generics are really useful. Array lists and lists, really useful. You're going to work with them in the project, which is coming up next.
О, еще практика будет. Попёрло.
In this video, we'll walk through how to accomplish the goals of the programming assignment associated with Module 3. Now, how do we start working with a project? Now, this video is going to be a little different than the last one. Rather than diving straight into the source code, I'm going to try to walk through how to get started with a project in general. Now, for this course, the best thing to do is to start by watching the overview video. So if you haven't watched the programming assignment overview video yet, you'll want to do that now, because the overview video gives you a clear idea of what's going to be required of you by the end of the project.
Ну, мы уже
It's
посмотрели.
important to have that high-level view. In fact, from just that video, you know that for this project, you're going to take a map that's given to you and add recent earthquakes as markers onto that map. Then you're going to make the markers appear different based on the magnitude of the earthquake. And lastly, you're going to add a legend so that if someone's looking at your map, they know what, say, a large red circle means. Well, that means it's this magnitude of earthquake. So those are the three big pieces we know of the assignment. Now, if you didn't have an overview video like we just provided, you'd want to try to glean that same idea by reading through this project description. Now, after watching that video, the next step is really to read through the project description. we put a fair amount of effort in making sure these project descriptions are clear to you. This also means, though, that this project description may change with time. So if it's not quite the same as you see in this video, it's because we've changed it and tried to make it better for you. So the first step is really to start reading top to bottom. So what are the big learning outcomes? What's expected of you for this? Read through the introduction. As you're reading through, look for things to keep in mind as you go forward with the project. For example, when you read this, it says that you're going to be reading live data from an RSS feed. You may not know what an RSS feed is. You may not know how to parse one. So there's kind of a question in your mind then. Are you going to be required to write the code to read the RSS feed, or is that provided to you? So we'll want to look for that when we look at the code later. Just keep reading through the introduction. You'll notice that in a number of these, we're going to tell you resources to have open. Now, when you're working through a programming project, it's almost always a good idea to have Java reference open on your computer. So pull up a Chrome tab, have that open right there, and then you can just start looking for the features that you need and the references that you need. This is true for essentially all programming projects, but in my own personal experience, I found it absolutely essential when working with a GUI. Because when you're working with a GUI, there are tons of libraries. And it's not that important to memorize how to, say, write text on a GUI. Because you just look up, how do I write text in the processing library with a GUI, and you'll find that there's a method called text. So again, not important to memorize these kind of methods because you can always look them up. So right now, open up another tab in Chrome and essentially open up these two. After you have those open, it's important to walk through what you'll do. Now, the overview video that I already provided gives you a pretty clear idea of what's required for this assignment. But if we didn't have that overview video, you would want to read through this fairly carefully. At the very least, read kind of the bolded high-level points. You're going to see that your first step is going to be to open up the starter file for this assignment, to trace through the starter code and predict what's going to happen when you run it. Since that's your second step, by the way, I'm going to make sure when we look at the code not to run it, so that you can still walk through the step on your own. Then you're going to want to add code to display markers for each of the earthquakes. Then you'll add code to style each of those markers based on the magnitude of the earthquake. And then you're going to add code to draw the key. Now there's a whole bunch of details that I just skipped over. You can always come back to these when you get to those steps in the project. But right now, you've got a really clear idea of what's required of you. The next step is to figure out what we've given to you. So dive into your code. This is really step one here, and I'll walk through it with you. Dive into your code and see what's there. So what I have here is Eclipse open. I'm in module 3 of our UCSD unfolding maps collection, and we have our earthquake city map.java file. This is the code that we provide you. Now, you're going to see a number of things in common with the last project. For example, there's still this Boolean flag, which if you're working offline, you need to set to true. If you're working online, you can just leave this alone. Now you'll notice there's 2 threshold values. This is going to be really useful when we start looking at changing the appearance of the earthquake markers based on the magnitude. We've got a map, just like we have the last project. We've got a URL, which looks like it's associated with the RSS feeds. And then, just like our last project, we have a setup method that's going to create a p-applet of this size. We're going to create a map, these 2 maps right here. If you're offline, you're going to use our local provider. If you are online, you can use Google Map Provider. You're going to zoom to a certain level of the map. And then, just like in the last one, this is going to make it so the map is interactive. We'll dive into the details again of how that's interactive in a later module. But as we scroll down, now we're to some really new stuff. A list of markers. This looks like this is where we're going to keep essentially markers for all the earthquakes. And down here, it looks like we've got a list of earthquakes, which we're going to get from the RSS feed. In fact, wait, this is good news, right? We've got a parse feed class that has a method called parse earthquakes. So remember I said back when we were looking at the RSS feed, we should keep this in mind. Is this something we're going to have to do, or is this code that's provided to us? Turns out it's code that's provided to you. If you're curious, though, about how to parse an RSS feed, feel free to go into our parsing section, go into the parsefeed.java. You can open that up, you can see how we parse these RSS feeds. But it's not critical, and you can do this essentially if you want on the side. Back to our code. You'll notice that the very next step has if we essentially have pulled in some earthquakes, do something with that. You can work through this code kind of line by line, but essentially at the high level, it's taking an object from this earthquakes list, which is a point feature, and converting it into a magnitude. That's fantastic, because we're going to need magnitudes later when we're trying to decide how to display these earthquakes. So let's keep this in mind as a useful thing going forward. Looks like we also have a color yellow created for us because we're going to want to make one of the markers yellow. And now we're getting to our to-dos. So our first to-do is to say, create all the markers and attach them to the map. Now, it looks like we already have a list of all the earthquakes. It's just a matter now of converting all of our earthquakes into markers. Now, if you're not quite sure how to do that, we give you a helper method which takes a point feature and converts it into a simple point marker. This will help you get started for essentially creating all the markers and then adding them to the map. But this method isn't quite done yet, because you may want to change the appearance of the markers based on the magnitude. And this is probably a good place to do that. You'll notice that we still have a draw method, which draws the map, and that also does something called add key. If you scroll down some more, you're going to find that that's a helper method, and it looks like we're going to use this to draw the key or the legend on the left-hand side. And we're going to draw this using the processing graphic methods. At this point, we've got a pretty good idea of what's required in this project. You can really get started. Now, if you run into any problems, remember that there are a number of hints in the write-up. So look at those hints first, and then if you still have problems, feel free to turn to the forums or other lectures from this module. I hope you have fun. Good luck.
Ну что, понеслась. Старт 5 часов. Старт. Открываем стартовый файл. Стартовый файл у нас вот он. Close all. Угу. Дальше что? Earthquake. Так вот сделаем. You should see, double click on it, don't pick REST package. There's a file, the same name in future model packets. If you open trace the starter code, predict what happens if you run and then run it. Подумайте о том, что будет, если вы его выполните и выполните, дабы убедиться, что нифига не заработает. Step 3, Step 4. А где главный-то? PSVM где? Public static void main. Public static void main. Ctrl F12. Что-то вы к нам не заходите. Да пошли нахуй. Кому вы нужны? Ой, я из-за вас не туда нажал. А где main? Он типа исполняемый, а где старт? Ой. Ой. Кто-то хочет что-то по Авито мне спросить. Ну давайте. Поугараем. Здравствуйте. Без жестких дисков видеокарту можно купить? Без жестких дисков видеокарты. О, господи, нифига себе там. Что это такое интересно было? Новые фолловеры. А что за фигня? Почему у меня все фолловеры вылезли? Все, кто можно. Бред какой-то. Сломалась, походу, тема. Ну ладно. Так. Выполните код. Мы не обещаем. Да-да-да. Вы можете. Да-да-да. It's okay. Also know you might able to skip prediction step, but example like good to practice trace code and explain doing da-da-da. Not to learn working. Для тех, кто учит офлайн. Пофиг. Добавьте код для вывода для вывода маркеров location. Да-да-да. Нам надо сделать сначала, чтобы он работал. Чтобы он работал, нам надо сделать PSVM, да? Applet main. Блин, можно так вот. Отлично. Проверим, как все это выведется. И выведется ли. Опять неправильный провайдер, да? Неправильно написал. Module free. Надо вот так вот делать. Так, правильно? Прекрасно. Она выводится на экран. Теперь мне нужно сделать так, чтобы выводились на экран точечки. Точечки у меня в степ 3. Степ 3 это у меня вот здесь. Вот здесь у меня идет парсер. Добавьте точки, которые вызываются методом createMarker. Для того, чтобы создать новый simple point marker для каждого point маркера вот в этой хрени. В земные точки, что ли. Не знаю, как это переводится. Затем добавьте каждый из этих маркеров в лист маркеров. Угу. То есть у меня здесь должно быть for i. Point future x is для каждого point future, который называется x, у нас будет, мы будем называть его point. Для каждого поинта отсюда делаем в цикле переборку и добавляем then add each. Дальше мы для того, чтобы создать simple marker равняется new simple point marker. А там, подожди, там какие-то были варианты конструкторов. Hashmap string object. Или просто создать. Давай пока просто создадим. Маркер. Set radius is inside draw. Hashcode equals get. А там, наверное, set есть. Set 3. Set location Установи цвет, установи позицию. Блин, мне кажется, проще сделать этот через другой конструктор. Hashmap string object hashmap строка объект. Что же тут запихать? У меня здесь, может быть, есть какая-то подсказка. Following. Let's see first step. In the setup method, you should create a simple point marker object for each point future. In the list futures inside method, you will need to add a loop where the comments inside to do so. Inside the loop, you can call the method create marker to create and use simple point marker. У меня есть метод create marker. Да, point future, точно. У меня здесь есть метод уже заготовленный. Прекрасно. Супер. Читайте документацию. In the list, then you will add each new point marker to the markers list. List markers, markers, add marker. Okay. Do not call the draw method on the markers. That method will call it automatically for you when you add the markers on the map. As long as you have added the simple point markers to the markers list, they will be displayed automatically. Ну-ка, давай попробуем. Вылезет что-нибудь автоматикали или не вылезет? О, точечки вылезли. Кто гений? Я гений. Хорош? Да просто божу. Просто божу. Сам в шоке, блядь, от того, что делаю. Но вроде, видите, вроде не тупой. Ну, как видите. Один зритель сегодня. Что-то все сегодня спят. Видимо, было долгое сонное вступление. Люди слились. Слабаки. Добавьте код в метод create marker для того, чтобы выделить визуально каждый маркер. Create marker у меня где-то был тут. А я же знаю, теперь я могу Ctrl F12 переходить вот так вот. Оп. Чисто гений. Вот степ 4. Вот здесь вот мне надо что-то написать. Новый фолловер. А сможешь писать только через 10 минут. Защита от спама. Блин, а кстати, я хочу понизить. Можно понизить до минутки? Просто спамер это вряд ли больше минуты продержится. Панель управления. Канал. Разрешить рейды, почему бы и нет. Роли, модерация, партнерство. Видеостудия, канал, аналитика, роли. В ролях, что ли? Нет. О, у меня даже модеры есть. Модерация. Задержка. Режим только для фолловеров. Но вот реально нету больше ничего. 10 минут почему-то только. Или выключен. Или 10 минут, или выключен. Так что извините, ребят. Ну никак. Отжим только для фолловеров. Тоже здесь тоже вон 10 минут. Нет другого варианта. Так что сорянба. Заблокировать гиперссылки нет. Задержка немодерированного чата. Секунды. Ну и все. Не сработало. Терпите. Терпите 10 минут. По-другому никак, ребят. Сорян. От 4 до 4,9 и от 5 выше. А у меня здесь есть какое-то число int, что я должен обработать? Marker get location. А я хочу запустить отладчик. Можно задебажить? Попробовать. Давненько не делал. О, разрешить. Разрешить. И вот мы встали. Прекрасно. Поработаем с отладчиком. С отладчиком поработать это важно. Так, мне надо понять, что у меня есть. Float Mac. Mac у меня 2.6. Угу. То есть если у меня Mac, а потом у меня есть int yellow. А, это как пример. А, правильно, здесь написано. Here is example. If Mac меньше 4.0. А здесь почему интересно? 2.6. Ой, я забыл, как синтаксис пишется. Прикольно. А можно if Ctrl-Q. If not is free. If not. Нет, это не то. Это же как-то с скобочками. Там вот так вот. Блин, я забыл как. Забыл синтаксис. Ну и чё, как это называется? Чухня. А, ну вот он, синтаксис-то. If Mac меньше 4.0. Маркер, объект. Return маркер. А в маркере что у меня? Маркер. У меня здесь есть color. Маркер. Color. Set color. И здесь можно int. Интересно. Меньше 4. Окей. Else. If Mac больше или равно 4 и меньше и Mac меньше 4,9 меньше или равно тогда. Будет, я так назову, все равно на похуях. Окей. Будет 155 и 55 просто. Цвет будет yellow 2. Else. Marker set color yellow free. Окей. Stop. Reckon class. Попробуем, посмотрим, что получится. Ошибка. If not. Так я его не использую. На что он ругается, я так не понял. Непонятно на что. Что-то ругался. Ну вот он, пожалуйста, что-то разрисовал. You played will see something like. Похоже. Блин. С увеличением. Ну, add code to Java key. О, вот это интересно. Вот это интересно. Давайте добавим код. А где писать? To do step 4. Add code to this method. That's okay. Step 4, okay. No. А, вот. To draw a key. Add code describing the style and display to the left of the map. Use the drawing methods found to applet class to draw shapes which looks like markers. Use it and add a corresponding text next to it. Implements this in add key method, which will be called from the draw method. This part you find the processing graph method useful, and you can find a reference here. Okay. In structural method text, reach, ellipse and fill will come handy, but you can and should also feel free to explore and use any other method that will be useful. Ну, короче, понятно. Делайте как хотите. Будьте креативны. Шестое нам не надо. Короче, нам надо нарисовать легенду, но это просто пипец. Map. Draw. Add markers. У нас было map 2 в прошлом примере, по-моему, да? Сейчас откроем. Мы делали map 2, new UFO landing map, zoom blend, zoom. Короче, мы делали новую карту, делали map plant и делали draw. Но у нас сейчас так не прокатит. Это настройки, это маркеры, это рисовалка, а это add key. И в add key мне нужно что-то добавить. В add key. И самое главное понять, куда добавлять. Маркер менеджер. Ебать. Это добавлять маркеры. Это зум. Это геттеры. Мне нужно создать что-то другое. New of landing map. Это получается image legend равняется new rect. Это кто у нас? Квитанция, расписка. Ellipse and fill. Text fill. Это заполнение. Rect. Ну попробуем ellipse, короче. Ой. Привет. Ну как курсер поживает? Да неплохо, слушай, довольно-таки легко и быстро. Редкие затыки бывают. Ну, из-за того, что просто не совсем библиотеку все знаю. Не совсем еще понимаю, как она работает. А так, в принципе, приятно. Ну, то есть, ну, с заданиями, прям, чтоб встрял, такого не было. Shape, структур. А вот здесь же можно, например, эллипс. Вот так вот. А можно посмотреть, как это рисуется? New ellipse. И что, прям маленькими, что ли? Что такое эллипс? Эллипс. Ну, предположим, 50. 50. 50. 50. А что ты хочешь сказать, что он мне сейчас что-то выведет? То есть здесь такие простые методы, что ли? Сейчас у меня здесь будет какой-то эллипс. Ну тогда это неинтересно. Окей. Тогда это такое. Я думал, там что-то поинтереснее будет. Я даже не хочу делать, честно. Но здесь типа надо сделать вот это вот. Но я уже понимаю, что здесь просто втыкай координаты, подбивай по параметрам, да вводи текст, вводи цвета. Ну это такое. Можешь попробовать в Академию Яндекса поступить. Нифига себе, ты что, я туда не поступлю. Я слишком тупой. Mark is complete. Go next item. Сейчас будет финалочка. Во, здесь еще этот опросник. Давайте отвечать. 8 вопросов, можно сделать одну ошибку. Does you map doses? Да, множество разных точек, да. Does you map display key shown explained marker and that key initially organized such a manage below? Yes. Which class do you create object to of display? Which class do you create objects of to display the earthquake dots on map? По-моему, какой класс ты создавал? Simple point marker, по-моему. Assume, как предполагать. Предположим, у вас вы имеете simple point marker, в который положили переменную маркер. Which of the following lines of code set the marker colors to red? RGB. Вот так вот. How many different simple point methods does your program create when you run it? каждый на точку. По один на точку. What was most difficult? Да ничего сложного нет. If you said something. None. Иначе напишите «на». Сейчас как чихну. Ой. Простите, пожалуйста. Безобразие. How long do you total spend programming? 30 minutes. Understand. Submit. Сколько ошибок? Ни одной ошибки. Чистый гений. Чистый гений. Дайте мне сразу работу сеньора. Я буду вам кружочки рисовать. В какой-то задрипанной старой библиотеке. Congratulations. You are mastering user interface. Корректные ответы жирные. Да я все ответил уже. Go next item. И у нас неделя 4 началась. Давайте посмотрим, из чего состоит 4-я неделя. Потому что предыдущая имела в себе очень много. Закончить к 8.05. Типа я должен закончить это по их плану к 8.05. То есть я должен потратить еще 3 недели. Чтобы вот к этому числу закончить. Это они изначально рассчитывали, что я закончу к этому времени. Я вас разочарую, молодые люди. Я боюсь, что мы очень быстро это закончим. Тем более, просто еще очень много видосов смотрим. Вот здесь было где-то очень много видосов. Блин, я даже сейчас не могу посмотреть. Было около, наверное, 3 часов. 2 часа точно было полноценных. Ну ладно, пойдем. Пошла музня. Музня-возня. Сейчас часик позалипаем видосы и пойдем спать, наверное. До 2. Полиморфизм пошел. Давай. Что мы будем изучать на этой неделе? Посмотрим, как наследуется значение переменных в объектно-ориентированном программировании. Посмотрим. Подожди, это наследование, это extends. Наследование. Подожди, как? Я не помню, как по-русски это extends переводится. Есть какой-то термин. Explain a relationship between superclass и subclass. Найдем разницу между суперклассом. Объясним связь между суперклассом и подклассом. Будем использовать EML-диаграммы для отображения иерархии классов.
Hierarchies.
Господи, ужас какой. Explain this. Объясним отношения является между классами. Поймем, как конституция Java объекта происходит изнутри. Будем использовать такой же суперкласс конструктор при создании класса. Создадим метод, перезаписываемый суперклассом. Создадим метод, перезагружаемый. И метод перезагрузить. Что? Объясним принцип полиморфизма. цель полиморфизма. Шагнем в дискуссии времени компиляции и времени исполнения. Используем приведение объектов, чтобы помочь компилятору. Нихуя себе. Будем использовать слово абстрактное. Сравним интерфейс имплемент. Господи, сравним и сопоставим наследование реализации, наследование интерфейса. И объясним разницу между абстрактным классом и интерфейсом. То есть, короче, все вот это весь вот этот вот курс, это первая глава шилта, прям полноценная. Довольно сочно, насыщенно.
We'll be going further with our graphing of earthquakes onto the world map. The past assignment was really neat. You displayed earthquakes on a map and had their appearance determined by the magnitude of the earthquake. But knowing the magnitude of the earthquake alone isn't really enough information to understand the potential impact of that event. So we'll be going further with this idea in this module by making the earthquakes appear differently based on the location of the earthquake, the depth of the earthquake, and optionally, the age of the earthquake. But we'll continue to visualize the magnitude of the earthquake as the size of the marker. So there are a number of steps with this assignment, but let's try to break it down into 4 high-level goals. The first goal is to add markers for major cities.
Мне так нравится, чувак
If you don't see your city
на
here,
немецкой
please feel free
статье
to add it.
рассказывал о том, что он тратил на это недели.
The second is to figure out
У
if
нас
earthquakes
получается за
occur in
вечер
the land,
неделю
and if
пройти
so, occurred in
целиком.
which country.
То есть
Then you want to draw the earthquakes
x7
differently
скорость.
if they occurred in the land
То
or
есть
in the
если с
sea.
такой же скоростью
And you'll
продолжать,
again change the size
ну
of the
пусть
earthquake
ладно, не
based on
x7
the
сделаем
onto
x5,
magnitude.
среднюю по палате,
Now, where earthquakes
то это будет
occur
не за год, а за
matters,
2 месяца.
as the threat they pose is affected by whether or not they're underwater,
Прикольно.
it could cause a tsunami, or if they're in land, it could cause physical damage to surrounding areas. The third goal is to change the color of the marker based on how deep the earthquake occurred. Again, the depth of the earthquake changes its potential impact to the surrounding areas. Lastly, as an optional goal, you can add an X to the earthquakes which occurred in the past day. To accomplish these goals, we'll be using features of both inheritance and polymorphism in Java. So be sure to check out the videos on these topics if you're unfamiliar or uncomfortable with those ideas. This was one of my favorite parts of the project. I hope you'll enjoy it too. In this module, we're going to begin looking at inheritance and polymorphism in Java. Now, inheritance and polymorphism are incredibly powerful features to any object-oriented programming language. But unlike loops or conditionals, you don't necessarily need to use inheritance and polymorphism for your code to work. When you first started programming, you probably could have put a lot of your code in main and gotten away with it. But as your code grew, you started using methods, and then later started using classes. Likewise, as the complexity of your project grows and you start working on large software design projects, you start having to use inheritance and polymorphism to be able to handle the complexity of the project. You've already worked with inheritance and polymorphism to some extent by having used the keyword extends in your previous modules. What we're going to do here is start working in more detail with inheritance and polymorphism. The goal here for this single video is to look at the value of inheritance in itself. We're going to do this by posing a potential problem. Imagine you're
Отписался бот.
a software engineer at a university.
Безобразие.
And you've been working for some time on a person class. You've actually tested the code. It's much longer than the code that you see here, and you're very happy with it. But your software design team comes back to you and says, we really can't just have one class anymore. This needs to start behaving differently for students or faculty. So you think about how you're
Я
going
на
to
самом
solve
деле
this.
все
And
это
there's a couple
помню,
of potential solutions.
но на
Neither of
всякий
these are going to
случай,
be good
конечно,
solutions, so I'm not going to dive into too much
повторю.
detail with them, but let's talk through what you might try to do. The first option is really to say, well, I'm going to keep all of this in the person class, and I'm just going to have it behave differently if you're a student or faculty member. And I'm going to do this by having a Boolean, which just says whether or not you're a student. True if you're a student, false if you're faculty. I'm going to add a constructor that handles it this way as well, and then in each of my methods, I can just do if student, do the code for the student, else do the code for the faculty. And at this point, this doesn't seem like that bad of an idea. But what's going to happen is your software design team is going to come back to you later and say, you know, we can't have all students behave the same. Undergrads and graduate students are going to behave differently. They have different needs, graduate students have thesis advisors, things like that. And then they'll come back to you and say, well, we need to behave differently if you're a full-time student or you're a part-time student. So what you'll do is you'll add now Boolean flags to say whether or not this is a graduate student or not, and a Boolean flag to keep track of whether or not you're full-time or not. And now your method's going to start looking something like if you're a student and you're a grad student and you're full-time, and if this sounds really ugly, it is. In fact, this kind of ugly code has a specific name for it. You may have heard of it before. It's called spaghetti code. Now I like spaghetti, but I don't like spaghetti code. Spaghetti code is code that you're going to write, you're going to realize how bad it is, you're going to throw it away, and you're going to start over.
Жрать захотелось.
So this solution we're not happy with. Let me pose another potential solution. Let's just take my person class and copy paste it into two files and rename one to be student and rename the other to be faculty. And then within the student class, I'm going to change all the code to match the behavior of a student. And then within the faculty class, I'm going to change all the code to match the behavior of a faculty member. At this point, this seems like a pretty reasonable solution. And this will actually work for a little while. But it's not going to work indefinitely. Take a few seconds to think about where it might go wrong.
When you want to have different behaviors for student faculty, when you want to make changes to the original person. Господи, мой английский такой английский. Сейчас. Оно в фуллскрине не работает почему-то. Когда вы хотите иметь другое поведение для студентов или преподавателей. А здесь что? Если вы хотите внести изменения в исходный код. Из следующих вариантов выберите, которые, скорее всего, вызовут проблемы, когда у вас есть два отдельных класса. Студент или факультет, которые назначаются. Здесь нет никаких проблем. Но, по-моему, рандомно можно выбирать, нет? Поддержание согласованности этих двух файлов для общего поведения будет проблематично. Продолжайте следить за более подробной информацией. Окей. Наследование-то оно для этого
If your
есть.
answer had anything to do with either consistency or the ability to store all the objects in one data structure, you're on the right track. So let's talk through both of those. What's going to happen is your design team is going to come back to you.
Им надо обоим сделать экстенс
having a
от
single
person.
string name isn't sufficient. We really need you to break this out as first name and last name. And this isn't a major change, so you go into your code, you start changing all the instances of name to now work with first name and last name, and you fix all the student class. And then you're going to realize, wait, I had name in the faculty class too. And you can't just copy paste the code that you just changed in student into faculty. You're going to have to rewrite all the faculty, do all the changes you just made in student to the faculty code. It's going to be tedious and it's unnecessary. But more important, what if you make a mistake? What if you miss a change in faculty that you made in student? This is going to be really hard to keep consistent. The other problem with this is there's probably some code that has an array of persons right now. What's going to happen if I now break this into two classes, only student and only faculty? Well, I can't keep that single array of persons anymore. I'm going to have to keep two arrays, one for students and one for faculty. I know there's no clean way to keep a single data structure for all persons.
Точно, сейчас часик проведем за видосом.
Well, what if I wanted to just sort by the time that the person came on campus? That'd be really hard to do. I could sort the students potentially, and I could sort the faculty, but how do I merge those? It's going to get ugly pretty quick. So neither of these answers are things that we're happy with. What do we want then? Essentially, we figured out the goals by looking at these two examples. The goals here are, one, to keep all of our common code in one class. It'd be great if we could do that. We also would like it so that if we have different behaviors, I split that different behavior into different classes. And lastly, I want to be able to keep all these objects in one single data structure. Now these are somewhat lofty goals, but the good news is they all come to us with inheritance. We're going to dive into the details about how to do this in the next video.
Спасибо, дядь. Пойдем дальше. Тут видосов 5, 8, 9.
In the last video,
18,
we began to see the power of inheritance and polymorphism in
24,
Java. In
27,
this video, we're going to start diving into the
30,
details. How do we make this work? The goal here is to use the keyword
40.
extends and
40
recognize what
минут,
that
короче,
does.
тут.
We're going to talk about the relationship between superclasses and subclasses and what those terms mean. And
20
we're going to
минут
use UML
тут.
diagrams to design our first class hierarchy. We left off with the last
Еще
video
час.
saying we want 3 key features. We want to be able to keep common code in one class. We want to be able to split out differing code between different classes. And we want to be able to keep all the objects in one single data structure. In this video, we're going to show how we can do 1 and 2 by designing our hierarchy. Item 3 will be in the next video. Where we left off was talking about 3 different classes: a person class, a student class, and a faculty class.
Перейдем сразу к
We're in
вопросу.
this video, and we'll come back.
Which of these instance variables seems like belong in either? Какие из этих переменных экземпляра кажутся принадлежащими к любому классу?
Is pause. Take a few seconds to belong in a student class that wouldn't belong in a faculty class, and vice versa. A few seconds, pause the video, and we'll come back.
Пол, зарплата, средний балл по классам. Типа, что относится как к каждому классу, что относится к конкретной личности. Зарплата у каждой личности своя, средний балл у каждой личности свой, а пол есть у всех. Ну, наверное, так. То есть наоборот. Наверное, вопрос звучал наоборот. Что относится, что будет уникальным. Понятно.
All right, there are a number of good answers here. Let's just talk through a couple that I thought of. So students get grades in their classes. In the American education system, we use something called a GPA, which is essentially just an average of all the grades that you've gotten. Students would have these, faculty would not. So in the student class, I'd have an instance variable named GPA, and then I'd have an accessor method called getGPA. What belongs in a faculty class that wouldn't belong in a student class? Well, maybe an office number, office phone, but also a salary. So faculty get paid, students generally do not. So I'm going to have an instance variable called double salary, and I'm going to have a method called getSalary to get access to this. We've already started designing our inheritance hierarchy. We have the code that's common up in the person class, and we have the code that's divergent in the student class and the faculty classes separately. This answers items 1 and 2 from our desire list. But we haven't answered 3 yet, and that's coming up in the next video.
Как бы не уснуть.
For example, I work on Google Docs, and what we do is we'll use a base class for representing format buttons. So every button has a specific style, an image, action that the button does, and we'll use that and we'll extend it to make things like the bold button, the italic button, the underline button. Another example of Google APIs that use inheritance is actually
Мальчик, тебя там в заложниках держит или что?
Extend the activity class. So an activity is a single focused thing that the user can do within an app. And an app can be made of several activities. And we use inheritance to prevent us from repeating code.
In the last video, we began using the keyword extends to unlock the power of inheritance in Java. We also designed our first class hierarchy and we're going to continue with that in this video. The goal here is to understand what the term ISA means and how it defines a relationship necessarily between classes. In the last video, we saw how designing our class hierarchy and using the keyword extends gives us the first two features on this list. It allows us to keep all the common code in one class. It allows us to split out the different behavior between separate classes. But what we didn't answer was how can we keep all the objects in one single data structure? And to figure this out, let's play an old-fashioned matching game. What I have here on the left is a reference, and on the right I have an object. What we're going to do is essentially play matching game. We're going to try to figure out, can you have this reference point to this object? Let's start off with person P equals new person. You've done this a whole bunch. Is this legal? Absolutely. The reason this is legal is because a person is a person. Somewhat reflective, we kind of recognize that. We'll use this term though, again, as we go forward. Likewise, is a student? Absolutely. A student is a student. Where this gets interesting is, can you have a reference, person, point to a student object? What I want you to do is think about this just for a few seconds. Do you think this should be allowed?
Do you think Java should let you это разрешено сделать person и student? Подожди, нет, person и student. Да.
I hope you said yes. This should be allowed. Now, this is new. You've likely always ran code where the reference was the exact same thing as the object. But you're actually allowed to do this. And the reason you're allowed to do this is because a student is a person. All the capabilities that a person has, a student has to have because it's derived from person. This is fantastic, because what this allows us to do now is to keep one single array of student and faculty objects. So this code, where I create an array of persons, or references to persons, and then I can fill it with references to a person object, to a student object, and to a faculty object. This code compiles and will work just fine. So we can now keep, whether you're a person, a student, or faculty, all in one data structure. This is fantastic. But we haven't finished our matching game yet. Can you have a student reference point to a person object? The answer here is no. Why? Well, not all the features of a student are necessarily within a person. And you can think about it kind of loosely as an analogy of, if you walked up to a random person on the street and asked them what their GPA is, well, that's probably not a very polite question to ask in the first place. But if you were to ask it, most people would say, I'm not a student, what are you asking me? This is why you can't do this. Now, why I brought up this example is because when we get to polymorphism in just a few videos, references and objects are going to become front and center. We're going to talk about what decisions are made at compile time based on reference type, and what decisions are made at runtime based on object actual type. But before we can get there, we have a few more details to work out with inheritance in the next videos.
So one of the problems I had when learning about inheritance was the is-a relationship. And my professor used some analogy along the lines of animals, and like a lion is an animal, and for whatever reason that went right over my head, and it really frustrated me because I feel like all my peers quickly picked it up. And so I reached out to my professor after class, and he just twisted the analogy to be cars, and he asked me what kind of car I drove, and I answered, I drove a Toyota. And he just relayed that same analogy, but back to cars and Toyotas. And he said, a Toyota is a car, but not all cars are Toyotas. And for whatever reason, that really clicked with me, and that's what it took.
Развлекательное
learned a little bit
видео.
about inheritance, and you played that
Скорее бы
matching
это
game Leo,
закончилось.
where you learned what kinds of references can refer to what kinds of objects. And it turns out that is a really, really tricky idea to get. So we've got a concept challenge for you that's going to exercise your ability to make those matches. Don't worry if this is a little bit tricky.
Так, чё я
It takes a while
теряюсь?
to get it. So work through it. You know the drill. Work through it on your own. Answer the in-video quiz. Discuss with others. Watch our learner videos, and then watch our explanation. Here's your challenge. We've got 3 classes. There's a person class. It has a name, member variable, and it has a getName method. There's a student class, which extends person. It has an ID member variable that's an integer, and it has a getID method that returns an integer. And there's a faculty class, which also extends person. It also has an ID variable, but this time it's a string, and it has a getID method that returns a string. We have 5 statements over there on the right that create new objects and assign references to refer to those new objects. All of those statements compile and run just fine. Your question is going to be to answer questions about which of an additional series of statements work and which cause errors at either compile time or runtime.
Сделайте все, которые выведут ошибку. О, господи, надо развернуть. Слишком много информацион. String n as getName. S это student, getName. Student public string getName, return name. Все окей. P равняется S. Person равняется student. Ну, я думаю, что это окей. Ладно, int m равняется p getID. S p getID. GetID это int. Окей, public, окей. Return ID. Я надеюсь, что имеется в виду return this ID. А, здесь this может не обязательно писать. F равняется Q. F это у нас faculty равняется Q person. Ошибка, наверное, будет. Несовместимые типы. O равняется S. Object равняется S. Ну, предположим. Я не уверен. Мы не скажем вам. Окей.
Okay. My name is Linda.
My name is Mustafa.
My name is Jason.
Mustafa.
So how did you guys answer question 1?
I seem to think that question 1 didn't have any issues. S is a student, and they're trying to get the name from the student, and
Well, I thought there was a problem with that because when I look at the class student, I realized there is no method called getName.
That's true, but student extends from person.
So it will inherit all the parent class methods.
Oh,
yeah, it's a public method.
Oh, so like when inherit the person's getName method.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. How about the second P equals S?
For the second one, I also thought it was fine.
That's fine.
Person P is a new person, and if you change the reference of P to become the object created from student S equals new student, then every student is a person.
Okay. So that's the part that I missed. I was thinking it would be a problem because student and person are not the same type, so I wasn't sure if you could cast it that way.
Oh, right. Okay. So pretty much like the P instead of referencing to person, I was referencing to students.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
How about the next line?
I didn't think that would work because person doesn't have a get ID method.
Right.
So like, where would it be looking to get that?
I thought that like during compile time error, since P is still a person, it will go into the person class and then look at, oh, where's the get ID method?
But
Yeah,
didn't we
something
just
like
update a person class with pointing to a student class?
The compiler doesn't know that.
Yeah.
I think the compiler still
Oh.
sees it as a person object because it was. I didn't originally
It's only
declare
at
it that way.
runtime that the compiler will see that P is actually a student.
Oh, okay. Even that, I believe we have to cast it, I guess.
Right.
How about the third line of code? Faculty equals person.
Person. Well, person isn't necessarily a faculty member. So like he was saying that if you go around and like ask a random person on the street, they might not have the information for faculty. So I'm not sure if you can cast the faculty as a broad term person.
Right. Not every person is a faculty.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And then the last one, object, O equals the student, or object class equals student class.
I think we previously learned that every object inherits from the object class.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
So
I
the S
see.
is a student.
Okay, like every class would inherit object, meaning there's implicit extent.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Ну, так, предположим. Как я и думал. Нет? Господи. Int m равняется p get id. P это person. Person не имеет метода get id. Правильно. Я просто подумал, что они по порядку будут выполнены, а они не по порядку будут выполнены. А здесь object может принять значение s. Ну окей. Я сомневаюсь, что это в жизни вообще
All right,
когда-то
let's step through these
пригодится.
lines one at a time to figure out which ones work and which ones cause errors. This first line here, it's pretty straightforward. It creates a new variable of type string called n, and it's going to set it equal to s.getName. So first we need to figure out, what is s? Well, s is a student reference. It's a reference to a student, and it actually does refer to a student object. And you can see that right here when we created that student object and assigned the reference s to point to. So now we can look in the student class and see if there's a getName method. So we look here, no getName method, but that doesn't so that getID method in person reference to a but at runtime, so that line will not work. What about this next line where we say
Вот это.
O equals S? So O is an object type reference, and S is a student object up here. Well, that should work, right? Because everything in Java is an object. So object types references are allowed to point to any kind of object that they want. So that one's pretty straightforward. That works. So
Окей,
now we're
понял.
done. And to summarize, what we found was this first line here was just fine. The next line here was also just fine because all students are people. The next line is not okay due to
Welcome back. At this point, we've been talking about what's inherited. We've used the terms private and public, and those visibility modifiers impact what gets inherited from one class to another. What we're going to do now is spend a little more time looking at the different visibility modifiers and how they impact us, particularly in relation to inheritance. By the end of this video, you should be able to use the appropriate visibility modifiers
Сейчас бы
when you're writing
кофейку
your class.
горячего.
Up to this point, you're comfortable probably with
Дайте
public,
лень.
which is less restrictive, and private, which is more restrictive. So public gives access to any other class, whereas private gives access only to the same class. Well, at this point, you likely have learned this rule of thumb. You should make all your instance variables private. You should make your public interface, your public methods, public. You can also have private methods. Those are your helper methods. This rule of thumb is actually still going to apply, even after we talk about the other visibility modifiers It's important to know how they apply. The other visibility modifiers are protected and packaged. So protected gives you access to within the same class, anything within the same package can access it, and any subclass can access it. Package, also sometimes called default, you have access from the same class, and you have access from the same package. The only difference really between package and protected is that package loses access by any subclass. So subclasses that are still in the same package, you still have access to, but subclasses outside your package you're going to lose. To really understand this, it helps to see an example. What I have here is a sample class. And that sample class has a public variable, a protected variable, a package variable, or default variable, and then a private variable. Let's add a whole bunch of other classes. Some within the same package, the dotted line denotes package, and then some are subclasses. We have subclass 1 in the same package. We have subclass 2, which is outside the package.
Это важно,
We have
да.
other 1, which just happens to be another class in the same package as sample. Then we have other 2, which is a class not in the same package and has no relationship in terms of inheritance with sample. If you have the public visibility, so W is accessible from anyone else. Now notice that I'm just saying public W. I'm not putting the
Protected будет
public
доступен
int.
только
You can fill in the value there.
внутри сабом, по-моему.
Public, anyone can access. Protected, you
Да,
only
внутри
lose,
саба.
essentially take away access to other 2. So things within the same package as well as subclasses.
Y
can access
дефолтный
this
будет
variable.
доступен внутри
Now,
пакета,
what I'm concerned
а
about here
private только внутри
is
класса.
why does other 1 have access to my variable x? Just because it's in the same package? Does that really make sense? Is that who we want to have access to our variables? In general, this is not a very good idea, and this is why we don't recommend using protected. If we look at package access, what you see is that we now have taken away access to subclass 2 from what we had from protected. But you'll notice that other 1 still has access to y. Again, why is some other class in the same package happen to have access to my variable? It doesn't make much sense, and this is why we don't recommend package access either. Lastly, we have private access, which you're comfortable with. It just means in the same class you can access this variable. Now that we've walked through the different levels of access, you see that public is the least restrictive and private is the most restrictive. But we still are going to apply the same rule of thumb. Always use public or private. There's only rare cases that you'll ever want to use protected or package.
Спасибо, дядь. Когда дело доходит до наглядности, что из следующего является хорошей практикой при разработке ваших классов? Перейти к частным переменным вашего экземпляра, но расширьте методы, которые вы хотите, чтобы использовали, были публичными. Установите все переменные ветви ваших экземпляров как еще доступны, чтобы мог использовать. Сколько осталось-то? 3, 4, 4, 4, 3, 5. 10. 10. Отлично. Еще вот это заканчиваем, до полиморфизма доходим и закругляем. Спать тоже надо.
And it worked for a little while. So I worked on it for a few weeks, got the code working, but over the next couple of months, I kept running into bug after bug after bug related to this code. And finally one day I had to go to a group meeting for a research group and say, I'm going to need to take 2 weeks and rewrite the code properly. I did. I lost 2 weeks of my life doing it, but it worked after that. No more bugs.
Можно закрыть кста.
I kept running into bug after bug after bug related to this code. And finally one day I had to go to a group meeting for a research group and say, I'm going to need to take 2 weeks and rewrite the code properly. I did. I lost 2 weeks of my life doing it, but it worked after that. No more bugs. So I learned inheritance the hard way. As we continue on in this module on inheritance, what we're going to do next is look at object construction. Now you've already written constructors before, so you might say, well, wait a second, why are we revisiting this? Well, the reason we're revisiting this is because now that we know inheritance, we now know some more details about how objects actually get constructed. So the goals of this video is to recognize that all objects actually are derived from the object class. And you may already know that, but we're going to dive into some details about how that actually works over the course of the next few videos.
Нормально.
And then we're also going to look at how Java actually constructs or initializes its objects really from the inside out. We'll talk about what we mean by that. We're going to keep working with this hierarchy that we've been working with before, where we have a person class as a superclass, and a student and the faculty classes as derived classes. And we're going to focus in on essentially one line of code. Student S equals new student. We know that the new statement, new, is actually an operator. And that operator means allocate space. And the second piece of this is, once given that space, reference that space to the constructor for initialization. In fact, constructors really should be called initializers, and you'll see in other programming languages, they're actually called init. So really what the student constructor does is just initialize the variables associated with the student. And the way that's going to do this is essentially from the inside out. So you're going to go all the way up the hierarchy, all the way up to object, and then you're going to come back down. And as you come back down, you're going to initialize all those variables. What we're going to do is step through this step by step to understand how this works. So first thing you do, after you've done new, you've created the space for the object, you pass that space to the student constructor. The student constructor then, the very first line of code, is going to send you to the superclass constructor, in this case, person. The very first line of code of the person constructor is going to immediately send you to its indirect superclass, or in this case, object. Now, the object constructor can initialize the variables associated with object, essentially filling in that part of the object. Once it's done, it returns back to person. Person now can initialize its variables, and then it's going to return back to student. And student now is going to initialize the variables associated with student. And through this process, we've essentially initialized all these variables, going all the way up to object and all the way back down. And that's what we mean by
Интересно, какие поля есть у объекта?
What you might be thinking at this point is...
Что, ссылка там будет? Какие-то явно какие-то системные.
Ever extending from the object class. And you may not have done so explicitly, but it still happens. And we'll talk about how that happens in the next video.
Ох, жестко. Так. При конструировании объектов в каком порядке инициализируются переменные? Сначала инициализируются наследованные. Они инициализируют, начиная с вашего подкласса, затем вы переходите к классу Object. Нет, сначала инициализируется.
In the last video, we saw how objects are constructed from the inside out in Java. And the way this happens is really through compiler rules. We're going to talk about what those compiler rules are and how those compiler rules work in order to ensure, again, that the object is created from the inside out. What we left off in the last video is we'd seen the process. We'd seen how student calls person, which calls object, and then those constructors return back, and in the process of returning back, they actually initialize the variables. But you said at the end, well, wait, I don't remember extending object. Well, where did we do this? And this introduces our first rule associated with the compiler. So let's revisit where the compiler plays a role in our process. You write code, human readable, Java code, and that gets sent off to the Java compiler. Java compiler is going to do a number of passes. In fact, there's a number of potential specializations you could write essentially just on how the compiler works. What we're going to focus in on is essentially a couple of passes the compiler does in terms of inserting code. When the compiler is all said and done, we know it produces the bytecode, which we then run on our Java virtual machine. So what is the Java compiler doing, and what are these rules? Well, what it does is it's going to change the code. So if you wrote this class, public class person, and you just have your single instance variable and have done away with any other code, it's just this class, is this actually what gets compiled? In a sense, no. Because the compiler takes this code and it's going to change the code a bit. What it's going to do is follow the 3 rules that we're going to talk about in this video. First rule is, if you don't have a superclass, the compiler is going to give you one. It's going to give you object. So even though you wrote public class person, the compiler is going to insert the terms extends object. By doing this, now you see how person inherits from object. It's just because it inserts those lines of code implicitly. But where then did we call the person constructor or the object constructor? We know now that object inherits, person inherits from object, but we don't know where those constructors are being called. That's where the next set of rules come. So first off, if you don't have a constructor, Java is going to give one for you. It's going to give you a default constructor, so no arguments. And then it's going to apply another set of rules, which are associated with all constructors. This set of rules, or rule 3, is that the first line of a constructor has to say either this, and then some arguments, so call another constructor within the same class, or it has to call one of the parent class constructors, a superclass constructor call. It has to do one of those things. And if you don't do it, Java is going to insert super. So it's going to insert a call to the default constructor of your superclass. So now we see that we've added this line to the person constructor. In a sense, you had the code on the left, but the compiler is going to insert all those elements in blue on the right, and that's what's really going to get compiled. So now that we have an idea of how this works for person, I want you to pause and think about what would happen to the student class on the first pass by that compiler. Alright, if you were thinking we should add a very similar constructor to student that we did to person, you're on the right track. We can't, it already extends from person, so we can't extend from object. It already has a superclass, so there's no need to do that first rule. But the second rule applies. It has no constructor, so we have to insert a default constructor. And then the third rule applies. I have to make sure I call the default constructor of my superclass as the very first line of my default constructor here. So you're going to take that code in black above, and it's going to get transformed into the code in blue below. So when we were curious, how is the compiler making sure that the construction and the initialization...
Что с тобой опять не так?
And then the third rule applies. I have to make sure I call the default constructor of my superclass as the very first line of my default constructor here. So you're going to take that code in black above, and it's going to get transformed into the code in blue below. So when we were curious, how is the compiler making sure that the construction and the initialization of our variables happens essentially from the highest level of the hierarchy all the way back down? It's because the compiler makes it happen. Now there's still kind of one leftover problem, and that is we haven't actually initialized anything, right? All of our default constructors have done no initialization. They've just made sure they go all the way up to object and all the way back down. And we had at least one variable, and that was name, the instance variable with person. In our next video, we're going to see how to initialize that.
What do you think we are teaching you about the rules a compiler applies when compiling your code? We really like Java programming. You likely need to know there's the same point to successful debug code. Окей, поперли дальше. Веселуха, пипец. Скорее бы это закончилось.
In the past
Еще
couple of
15
videos,
минут.
we've been starting to look at how class creation or object creation happens in Java. Specifically, how does inheritance apply to object creation? In the last video, we actually looked at a number of compiler rules. Now, these compiler rules are what the compiler does when it looks at your code. Now, the reason we want to know about these rules is because it's going to help us trace our code. In fact, we're going to see an error in our code here in just a little bit, which comes about because of these rules. We're also going to use same class constructors and superclass constructors to help with class creation. Now, we started by saying all objects are created from the inside out. In the last video, we saw how the compiler rules make this happen. But what we did with the last video was essentially just create a number of default constructors without actually initializing anything. So what we're going to do now is modify these to initialize the name variable. Again, you've likely initialized a variable before in a constructor. What we're focusing on are the elements that apply to inheritance. So let's start off with our person class. Remember that the extends object was automatically put there by the compiler, and what we're going to do instead of having it automatically put there is we're going to explicitly put it here. Likewise, I'm going to explicitly put the default constructor, which would have been inserted by the compiler anyway. And what we're going to do now is modify this default constructor to initialize the name variable. So let's add a string argument to the constructor. Let's add this.name equals n, and just do what we would have done before. Now, to be honest, if we didn't have that call to super, we'd be fine. But because I've now inserted this line, I've got an error. Remember that rule? The very first line of a constructor has to be a call to your same class constructor or to a superclass constructor. I have broken this rule by saying this.name equals n. And because I have a call to super after that, this is going to produce a fairly cryptic compiler error. Now you know what that error means, and you can fix it by just switching the order. So now I'm calling my superclass constructor correctly, and now I can initialize my variable. Let's modify the student class now to initialize the variables there as well. So let me take that default student constructor, and I'm going to make changes to it. I'm going to insert string n, I'm going to insert as a parameter, and I'm also going to initialize that variable. Is this going to work? I want you to pause and think about this for a few seconds, look at the code, and see if there's any errors here. If you start to recognize that I'm not allowed to say this.name, you're right. That's a private variable in the person class. I'm not allowed to directly access that in the student class. I'd have to use a getter or a setter to do so. But I don't have a getter or setter. Is there a way for me to do this? Can I initialize name without having a public getter or setter? The answer is yes. All I have to do is change this now to call the superclass constructor that takes an argument, which is going to initialize to be name. Perfect. So just cross out those two lines, replace it with super with that name variable being passed in, and it's going to initialize everything properly. Let's go a little bit further with this, though. Let me add one more constructor to that student class. Let me add in, so this is our code from where we just left off, and now let me add in that noarg default constructor. Now what you might be tempted to do with that noarg default constructor, and let's just throw in some kind of default name here, is to just say super student. This would work. It's not the worst idea, but is there a better way to do this? Yes, there is. Right? There's no reason I should be calling the superclass's argument constructor when I have one in my own class. A better way to do this would be to do it like this. I should use my own same class constructor if it's available to me, because there may be code within my same class constructor which does things that I want to initialize based on this. I shouldn't just jump straight to the superclass. By having done all these pieces, we now see how object creation happens in Java. We see that it happens from the inside out, we see that everything inherits from object, and we now know how to use superclass constructors and own class constructors to design our classes better.
Is this constructor below? What will compiler add to it? Super set name. What's this set name? No, public this. Где же нет extends? Почему я не прав? Почему супер? Они здесь не дописали, получается. Ну давай посмотрим. На самом деле это вызовет бесконечный цикл, если компилятор позволит вам это сделать. Конструктор student по умолчанию вызывает конструктор student. По умолчанию, который вызовет конструктор student по умолчанию. Ну да, компилятор не вставит этот оператор в код. Это не позволит вам сделать это. Понял. Логично. Согласен. Исправился. Пошел дальше. Ну это скорее фича какая-то такая, которую не особо-то и надо знать. Все равно ты ее прописать не можешь. Компилятор
All
выдаст
right, in
ошибку.
Leo's video, you learned how objects are created from the inside out. So in this concept challenge, you're going to be tracing through some code that calls some constructors, and the goal is to figure out what gets printed as these constructors run. So you know the drill, you've done these before. What you're going to need to do is you're going to need to be somewhere where you can spend a little time on this and pause the video, answer the quiz by yourself first, and then find some friends, find some people you're taking the class with, either in person or on the online forums. Try to discuss this question, see if you all agree, and then watch our learner video. And finally, watch our explanation. So if you're ready to go, here's the challenge. You can see over here that we've got two classes. There's a person class and a student class. And those classes have a number of constructors. The person class has a single constructor. It takes one argument, a string. And the student class has two different constructors, a no argument constructor, and then a constructor that takes one argument. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a single call to the student constructor, to the default constructor, right up here. And it's going to create a student object. And the question for you is, what gets printed when we make that call? So go ahead and pause the video and take the online quiz that's coming up.
Consider the following class. Response main method you call. What's the order of the statements printed? В каком порядке все это будет вызвано? Когда я создаю вот эту строчечку, вызываю. S равняется student. Student S, new student. Создаем new student. У меня идет без параметра, да, вызов. То есть вот этот. Он вызывает супер сначала. В любом случае. Так как у меня extends person. В супере у меня ничего нет. Потом this student. Потом он вызывает вот этот, получается, метод. У меня все зависло или мышка зависла? Мышка сдохла. Мышка сдохла, хвост облез. Интересно. Молодая мышь. Вы далеко собрались? Интересно. Ну и что мне с тобой делать? Хочешь сказать, что ты за 3 дня сожрала мне все батарейки? Я тебя выкину тогда. %. Ёбнулась, что ли? Мать. Столько 2 дня назад заряжал. Чё, одурела? Ну, короче, мышка-помойка. Я понял, ладно, на таче пока поработаем. Теперь у меня он вызывает вот этот. А в нем вызывается вот этот. Сначала будет нарисован 1, потом 3, потом 2. Есть такой вариант. 1, 3, 2. Submit. И мы не скажем вам до конца.
I'm
Давайте.
Linda.
I'm Mustafa.
Hello, I'm Jason.
Okay, so for this first question, I was a little unclear on the answer. My instinct was to go for E, for let's say just number 2, because the new student is the no argument constructor in the student class, and it just prints out number 2.
I was really confused about this too.
My first instinct was like it would be 3, 2, 1, because when you have a class and then it goes to constructor, it goes from the inner one and the most outer one.
Right.
And then I looked at it more carefully and I realized when you go to students, there's a super is implicitly inserted.
Well, I was confused because the no argument constructor first called another this constructor with a student. So I didn't know if it went first to the super class or to the other constructor within the one class. Because then the constructor within the one class calls super as well. So.
Ну, я все придерживаюсь того же мнения. Че, я не прав, что ли? Прав. Где моя Нобелевская?
Alright, so now that you've had an opportunity countered,
Она сейчас будет разбирать,
number sign 1, number sign 3.
почему так произошло. Еще 8 минут и спатеньки. Ура! Добби свободен.
Okay, here's another concept challenge for you, all about constructors. What happens when we call the constructor of the student class? We've got our familiar classes here. We've got our person class, and we've got our student class. And the constructors, check them out. They're a little bit different. We've got a one argument constructor for the person class, a no argument constructor for the student class, and then this additional method here in the person class, which is set name, which will set the name field inside the person class. So we're going to ask you to reason about what happens when you call the student constructor. And this is a concept challenge, so we want you to do the same procedure that you're used to. Just take that in-video quiz first by yourself, then find some people to chat about this question with, and then watch our learner video, and come back and watch our explanation.
И снова то же самое. Student says new student person. Конструктора по умолчанию нету, что ли? Нету. This set name. Я создал student. Student пошел. Set name, this name, and... А что здесь неправильно? Show what the main method you call. Student S равняется new student. Но он создаст new student с именем name. Name n равняется n. Присвоит все. В чем проблема-то? What will be a value of a name variable for this object? Student. Ну давай. Ну ты же сейчас опять будет. Мы не скажем вам. Давай.
Hi, I'm Alicia.
Hi, I'm Joanna.
Hello, I'm Justin.
Я все равно вас не понимаю. Давай.
Okay, so yeah, it's probably compile time error then.
У них ошибка компилирования, они считают. А почему ошибка компилирования? Student равняется new student. У него есть setter. This set name. У него есть extends. Set name у него доступен. Он void. Публичный. По-моему, должен. Или типа должно быть типа super set name. Ну давай проверим. Или так, или super должно быть set name. Ну значит compile error. Надеюсь, сейчас напишу, что это должен быть super set name. Super set name. Ну, я так и понял.
And the compile error that you're going to get is very, very cryptic. You're going to read it and be like, what are you talking about? There's no constructor with no argument. But Java did, and that's what's happening.
Понятно. Ну, такое. как бы очевидно. Ой, последние 5 минуточек и спатеньки.
Today we're going to be talking about method overriding. And you've already used method overriding when you did draw and setup methods back when you're designing
3 часа
Stroom. But
17
here we're going to
минут.
dive into
Жесть.
method overriding in a bit more detail. So the goal here today is to be able to create methods that override from superclass methods and to be able to contrast overloading from method overriding. Back when we first started talking about inheritance, we had 3 goals. And overriding really helps us have all 3. So we want to have common code in one parent class. And we can do this if we don't override a method. So if the method just exists in the superclass, we get that common code. But if we want our subclasses to behave differently, all we have to do is override the method, and now we get that different behavior.
Ты вернулся к продвижению Java. Да, вернулся. Да неплохо. Есть хорошие, интересные идеи, подвижки. Я, правда, сейчас уже заканчиваю. Но каждый вечер опять продолжаю. Сейчас цели есть. На работе повысили, все хорошо. Будем двигаться дальше в Яве. Третий день сижу. Третью ночь, точнее. С 22 по Москве где-то вот до 2. Завтра чуть попозже начнем, где-то в 23.
So the first example is to look at the object class itself. So we have a method in the object class called toString. And the odds are you probably already ran a toString method before, but if you haven't,
Кем работаешь? Программист и на 1С все так же. Как работал в 1С программистом, так и остался. Но только стал руководителем типа. Ну как, руководитель только на бумажке, ну и зарплату повысит. На следующей неделе поеду документы подпишу.
And to do so, we're going to override that object method's toString method. Now, a really basic way to do this would be to just return the name. And since all we have right now in our person class is a name, this is really all we can really do. And then in our code that calls it, we're going to create a person P, we're going to create a person that has the name Tim, and then we're going to call...
Сколько ЗП, если не секрет, но было 110, стало 130, но это до налогообложения. После налогообложения там останется где-то 112. Сколько остается? Со 113 отнимут. Из 30 еще 3900. 16900 отнимут. То есть это будет 12100. 13100. Да, 13. 100, 113, 100. Чистыми.
Now, if we run this code, what's going to happen? It's just going to print Tim. All right, well, let's add to our inheritance hierarchy. So now I'm going to go to my student class where we've already added a student ID and a get student ID, and now we're going to add the method toString.
Но в Яве это больше. В Яве перспектив большие. Ну, если за пару лет хорошо обучиться. Но я вот то, что здесь должно проходиться за неделю, я прохожу за вечер. Я не знаю, может так специально программа расписана как-то там для совсем новичков. Вот этот курс прям проходится прям только в путь. Но это первый курс. Вот я 3 недели, вот это 4-я неделя, я прохожу за 3-й вечер. Легко ли в России устроиться на работу программистом с достаточно ЗП? Зависит от того, где работаешь. Ой, где живешь. Если живешь ближе к городу какому-то, то вообще не проблема.
So now, if we walk through this code, I'm going to do student s equals new student. I'm going to print out that, which is going to call the toString method. The question is, what do we expect to see happen? Well, we expect to see the student ID number now followed by the name, which is exactly what we want to have happen. What happens now if I change the reference type? What if I make the reference a person instead of a student?
Надо проверить, кстати, там ссылка на Твиче работает на Discord. Просто мы в Дискорде очень много вопросов обсуждаем, так что если хочешь, заходи в Discord. Там все это можно поспрашивать, все это можно рассказать, подсказать, с чего начать, куда пойти.
Why is it going to print the student method?
Discord
Because of
вроде есть.
polymorphism. We'll get into that in the next lesson.
А, это битриксовый Discord. Надо прицепить свой 1С-овский, явовский. Так. Сейчас сделаем экспресс-приглашение. Изменить ссылку. Устареет никогда. Сгенерировать новую. Скопировать. Зайти. Во-первых, в чат. При желании заходи. А во-вторых, редактировать панели. Discord. Ставить. Сохранить. Фига ты шустрый. Видимо, дискордик-то у тебя где-то был. Блин, на YouTube-то этот YouTube, наверное, не работает. А, все правильно. Но на YouTube я не захожу, так что он только сейчас для того, чтобы сохранить там эти видосики. Записи. Ну-ка проверю, Discord правильно сейчас открывается? Да, правильно. Ну и все. На сегодня у нас все. А, стоп. Which the following is true of term method overloading. Перезагрузка метода. Два метода в одном классе имеют одно и то же имя, но разные параметры. Совершенно верно. Два метода с одинаковыми именами и одинаковыми параметрами в суперклассе и подклассе. Блин, хороший вопрос. Или не то? Я только что перешел. Усюк. Все, чисто гений. Все, на сегодня хватит. А ты давай подскакивай завтра в дискордик. Или стрим завтра будет у Миши на канале по Битриксу. Где у него здесь? Сейчас скажу. Вот тут он иногда стримит, а я у него это залипаю. Надо его добавить сюда тоже куда-то. Куда-то сюда. Так, и инструменты трансляции не то. Канал не то. Автоматическая ретрансляция, да. Список для ретрансляции. А, во. Надо его вот сюда добавить. Слышь, сука, уходи. Мишу только будем ретранслировать. Ну и все. За сим прощаемся. До завтра. Ну, точнее, до утра. Спокойной ночки.